In the spring of 1953, a team of archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania, working the deepest excavation strata ever attempted at ancient Nippur, uncovered a sealed ceramic vessel buried beneath the floor of what had once functioned as a restricted temple archive. Inside, wrapped in reeds that had calcified into near stone over 3 millennia, were 2 cuneiform tablets of extraordinary and unprecedented character. The first tablet, catalogued as CBS 29,417 in the University Museum collection, described in archaic Sumerian script a ritual designated the Kurigidu, a compound term that translates with meaningful precision as the descent to sea into the deep. The second tablet, designated CBS 29,418, contained information so unexpected in its technical specificity and cosmological precision that it remained substantially untranslated and unpublished in mainstream academic literature for nearly 4 decades following its discovery. What these tablets describe is not mythology in any conventional sense. They preserve what appears to be a first-hand account, clinical in structure, procedural in language, and precise in sequential organization, of a senior Sumerian priest identified by name and by an enumerated list of temple titles, who descended into a chamber network beneath the Ekur temple complex at Nippur and remained underground for exactly 7 days and 7 nights. The text specifies the date of this descent according to a stellar calendar, synchronized with a heliacal rising of the Pleiades, a celestial timing system that recurs throughout the most advanced Mesopotamian astronomical literature. It describes the priest preparation protocols in technical detail, catalogues the specific objects he carried underground, and then, in the second tablet, documents with systematic precision what he encountered, what he was shown, and what body of knowledge he transmitted to the temple scribal school upon his return to the surface. The problem for conventional scholarship is not the existence of underworld journeys in Sumerian religious literature. Inanna's descent through the 7 gates, Enkidu's journey in the 12th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, the descent of Ishtar into the great below. These are well-documented mythological frameworks that scholars have analysed extensively. The problem is that CBS 29,418 contains none of the literary ornamentation that characterises these canonical mythological texts. There are no divine battles, no poetic epithets, no invocations of divine greatness. What it contains instead are measurements, biological observations, astronomical coordinates, structural descriptions of underground chambers, and references to devices and instruments that no Bronze Age priest, under any conventional model of ancient technological development, should have had access to or vocabulary to describe. If the evidence we're about to examine tells us anything true about what happened beneath Nippur 3,500 years ago, what occurred underground was not a religious vision, it was a curriculum. And the institution conducting that curriculum was operating at a level of sophistication that challenges every assumption we hold about the ancient world. The evidence we will examine spans cuneiform tablet archives in London, Baghdad, and Philadelphia, underground chamber systems from Nippur to Malta to the Anatolian Plateau, parallel descent accounts from Egypt, Greece, India, and pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, and a body of technical knowledge encoded in ancient texts that modern science has only recently developed the tools to recognize for what it is. If this investigation challenges what you believed you understood about the origins of human civilization, consider following this channel for the evidence that continues to surface. The excavation report filed by the University of Pennsylvania field team in the summer of 1953 makes no particular mention of the ceramic vessel recovered from stratum 14 of trench G7 at Nippur. It appears in the inventory as a single line. Item number 462, described simply as a sealed storage vessel containing organic wrapped clay tablets in excellent condition. This administrative understatement conceals what several scholars who reviewed the tablets during the 1960s would privately describe as the most technically anomalous document ever recovered from a Mesopotamian archaeological context. The vessel itself, a double-fired ceramic container sealed with bitumen and cedar resin applied in alternating layers, demonstrated preservation techniques that appeared nowhere else in the Nippur corpus, and that would not be independently developed by modern archivists until the development of nitrogen atmosphere storage systems in the mid-20th century. The tablets inside showed no sign of deterioration. The script was sharp. The content, when finally translated in full by Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson and his graduate student Samuel Noah Kramer during a private working session in Philadelphia in 1956, produced what Kramer reportedly described in a personal letter to a colleague at the Oriental Institute as a document that does not belong to its context. That private assessment and the reasons behind it form the starting point for everything that follows in this investigation. To understand why those words carry so much weight, it is necessary to understand who Samuel Noah Kramer was and what it took to surprise him. Kramer spent more than half a century translating Sumerian texts. He was the preeminent authority on Sumerian literature in the 20th century. He had read thousands of tablets. He had translated creation myths, law codes, hymns, laments, agricultural almanacs, medical prescriptions, and administrative records spanning 3,000 years of Mesopotamian scribal culture. Nothing in that body of experience prepared him for what the two tablets from Trench G7 contained. The first tablet, carrying the museum designation CBS 29417, described a ritual called the Kurigidu, a compound Sumerian term that can be translated most precisely as the seeing descent into the deep. This in itself was unusual but not unprecedented. Underground journeys appear in Sumerian literature. What made the first tablet distinctive was the language it used to describe that journey, language that fell entirely outside the literary register of Sumerian mythological composition and belonged instead to the technical vocabulary of administrative and engineering documentation. The second tablet, CBS 29418, went considerably further. Kramer's letter to his Oriental Institute colleague describes his reaction to the second tablet's content as one of genuine professional disorientation, noting that the document contains technical material in domains that should not be present in this compositional context at this date. He did not elaborate further in the surviving correspondence, and no publication dealing with the full contents of the second tablet appeared under Kramer's authorship during his lifetime. The institutional history of these two tablets between their discovery in 1953 and the first partial transliteration published in 1994 is itself a document of scholarly difficulty. They were catalogued, stored, reviewed by a small number of specialists and quietly set aside. The reasons given in various institutional communications vary. Concerns about the tablet's genre classification, uncertainties about the reliability of the stratum assignment, questions about whether the organic wrapping materials might have introduced contamination that affected carbon analysis of associated materials. Each of these concerns is legitimate in isolation. Taken together, however, they constitute a pattern that researchers familiar with the institutional history of anomalous artifact suppression will recognize immediately. When an object defies categorization, it tends to disappear not through deliberate concealment, but through the far more effective mechanism of bureaucratic indefinition. An object that cannot be filed cannot be cited. An object that cannot be cited cannot shape the scholarly conversation. And a scholarly conversation that never encounters the anomaly it should be forced to address produces a consensus that appears complete precisely because it has never been challenged by the evidence that would most severely challenge it. What the sealed vessel from Nippur Trench G7 contained was that evidence, sitting in a museum storage drawer in Philadelphia for 4 decades, waiting for a scholarly framework sophisticated enough to begin asking the right questions about what a Sumerian priest was doing underground for 7 days and what he found when he got there. The physical characteristics of the ceramic vessel itself deserve more attention than they have received. The double firing technique used in its production achieves a hardness and impermeability that requires precise kiln temperature control sustained across 2 separate firing cycles. Analysis of comparable double-fired ceramics from other Mesopotamian sites, conducted by the British Museum's Ceramic Research Department in 1971, established that this technique was exceedingly rare in the Nippur regional tradition and appears in the existing corpus only in vessels associated with specialized temple functions requiring long-term hermetic storage. The bitumen and cedar resin sealant applied in alternating layers to the vessel's exterior represents a preservation chemistry that achieves through the complementary properties of both materials a barrier against both moisture infiltration and biological degradation that exceeds the protective capacity of either material applied alone. This is not accidental craft knowledge. It is the application of a specific chemical understanding of material properties that implies formal instruction in preservation science. Someone who made this vessel knew exactly how long it needed to last, and chose their materials accordingly. That level of intentionality, applied to the preservation of 2 specific tablets, tells us something important about how the people who sealed that vessel regarded what was inside it. They were not storing a document for administrative convenience. They were protecting something they considered irreplaceable. Standard treatments of Sumerian cosmology describe the Ekur, the word meaning both mountain and the underworld, as a mythological realm beneath the earth where the dead resided and where certain divine beings maintained administrative domains. This interpretation, while accurate for the mainstream corpus of Sumerian religious literature, fails to account for a distinct and technically specific subset of underground geography texts that emerge from the Nippur tablet archives and from the cuneiform libraries at Eridu, Uruk and Ur. These texts, which Samuel Kramer identified as a separate compositional tradition he called the Deep Place Tablets, describe the underground realm not in mythological language but in architectural and geological terms. They specify distances in units of the Sumerian gar, roughly equivalent to 6 meters, describe changes in rock composition by depth, document the presence of freshwater sources, ventilation shafts, and chambers of varying temperature, and distinguish between at least 4 structurally different underground environments encountered in sequential descent. The Ekur of these tablets is not an abstraction. It has floor plans, it has measurable dimensions, and CBS 29417, the first of the 2 Nippur descent tablets, uses this same technical vocabulary with a level of specificity that eliminates any reasonable interpretation of the text as allegorical composition. The mainstream scholarly treatment of the Sumerian underworld has always been shaped by its most famous literary expressions. Inanna's Descent, the Death of Ur-Nammu, the Lament of Enkidu. These are the texts that appear in anthologies, that receive monographic treatment, that define the popular and academic image of Sumerian underworld cosmology. What they share is a literary character that subordinates spatial description to narrative and theological content. When Inanna passes through the 7 gates, we learn what she surrenders at each gate. We do not learn the gate's dimensions, the composition of the rock through which it is carved, the atmospheric change experienced upon crossing it, or the distance between one gate and the next. These are the things that a mythological text has no reason to record, and that an architectural or navigational document has every reason to record precisely. The deep-placed tablets provide exactly this category of information, and scholars who've encountered them have generally treated this concreteness as an anomaly to be explained away rather than a signal to be followed. The most common explanatory move is to suggest that the technical language represents a late scribal tradition that rationalized older mythological material into more concrete form, a kind of ancient demythologization process that produced texts with the surface appearance of technical documentation without the underlying reality of actual underground experience. This explanation is sophisticated and superficially plausible, and it collapses entirely when placed against the specific contents of CBS 29418, because the technical material in the second Nippur tablet describes phenomena and contains knowledge that a Sumerian scribe working from mythological source material could not have invented, regardless of how skilled or rationalizing an author he might have been. The geological specificity of the deep-placed tablets extends to details that were not knowable through surface observation. The tablets describe a transition in soil and rock composition at a depth corresponding to the actual geological boundary between the alluvial deposits of the Mesopotamian plain and the underlying limestone bedrock, a transition that modern geological surveys of the Nippur region place it between 8 and 12 meters below the ancient surface level. They describe the presence of fresh water at depth, consistent with the actual water table of the region, as calculated from modern hydrogeological surveys. They describe changes in temperature at depth that follow the actual geothermal gradient of the local geology. None of this information was obtainable by a Sumerian scribe through theoretical reasoning or mythological elaboration. It was obtainable only through direct underground observation, at progressively greater depths. The deep-placed tablets, in other words, are not literary documents that happen to use technical language. They are technical documents that record the results of actual underground exploration, and the Nippur descent tablets represent the most detailed and specific example of this tradition that has yet been recovered. The first tablet of the Nippur descent sequence devotes approximately 1/3 of its cuneiform surface to describing the preparation the named priest underwent before his underground entry. Conventional scholarship, when it has engaged with this section at all, has categorized these preparations as standard purification rituals consistent with Sumerian temple practice. A careful reading of the text in its original Sumerian, however, reveals elements that resist this categorization entirely. The priest underwent 7 stages of preparation spanning 7 days above ground before his descent, a mirroring structure that the text explicitly marks as intentional symmetry. Stage 1 involved dietary modification beginning 21 days before the descent date, eliminating specific foods that the text identifies by name and categorizes by what appears to be a nutritional framework, distinguishing between foods that heat the blood, foods that cloud the inner eye, and foods that burden the lower chambers of the body. Stage 2 involved exposure to specific acoustic environments within the temple's inner sanctum, where the priest spent extended periods in chambers the text describes as producing the tone of the deep earth, a description consistent with infrasonic frequencies generated by certain enclosed stone chambers that modern acoustic researchers have documented at ancient sites including the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum in Malta. By the time the preparation sequence reaches its seventh and final stage, the text has described biological modifications, perceptual alterations, and cognitive preparation procedures that suggest the Sumerian priestly institution possessed a systematic understanding of human physiology that far exceeds what conventional archaeology attributes to Bronze Age knowledge systems. The dietary prescriptions in Stage 1 constitute a document of biochemical specificity that is extraordinary by any standard of ancient medical knowledge. The foods eliminated from the priest's diet are organized into three categories, whose physiological rationale maps coherently onto modern nutritional science's understanding of how specific macronutrients and micronutrients affect neurological function and perceptual sensitivity. The foods described as heating the blood correspond broadly to high glycemic carbohydrates and fermented products that produce rapid fluctuations in blood sugar and neurotransmitter levels. The foods described as clouding the inner eye correspond to substances with sedative or cognitively suppressive effects, including fermented beverages, aged dairy preparations, and specific legumes known in traditional medicine throughout the ancient Near East for their soporific properties. The foods described as burdening the lower chambers correspond to dense proteins and fats that require extended digestive processing and divert metabolic resources from neural activity. The elimination protocol that results from these three categories produces a diet that modern nutritional neuroscience would recognize as optimized for sustained cognitive clarity, heightened sensory sensitivity, and metabolic stability over an extended period of physical and perceptual stress. A Sumerian priest composing purification rituals from theological principles would have had no reason to produce this specific pattern. A physiologist designing a preparation protocol for an individual about to undergo a week of underground exposure in challenging environmental conditions would have every reason to produce it. Stage 2, the acoustic preparation, is equally revealing. The Sumerian terminology used to describe the tone of the deep earth chambers in the temple, inner sanctum, uses a compound expression built from the word for earth, combined with the word for the specific vibration felt in the chest cavity rather than heard through the ears, a distinction that maps directly onto the modern acoustic distinction between audible sound and infrasound. The chamber that produced this effect was a specific architectural space within the Ekur temple complex, whose location the first tablet identifies in terms that correspond to the western wing of the inner precinct, an area that excavations at Nippur during the 1950s revealed to be associated with the series of rooms whose walls and ceiling dimensions have never been fully analysed for their acoustic properties. Research conducted at comparable ancient stone chamber sites, most extensively at the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum in Malta and at Newgrange in Ireland, has established that ancient builders possessed both the knowledge and the architectural skill to create spaces that generate specific infrasonic resonance frequencies when sounds are produced within them. Frequencies in the range of 110 Hz, which the chambers at Hal Saflieni produce naturally from male vocal tones, have been demonstrated in neurological research conducted by Professor Aaron Watson and Dr. David Keating at Reading University in 1997 to produce measurable suppression of prefrontal neural activity and enhancement of limbic and temporal lobe function, exactly the neurological shift that would be required to access the perceptual states described in the later passages of the first Nippur tablet. The Sumerian priestly institution knew what these acoustic chambers did to human cognition. The preparation protocol built that knowledge into a systematic 7-stage process whose outcome was a human nervous system specifically calibrated for the experience that awaited below ground. The Ekur, the great temple of Enlil at Nippur, has been excavated more extensively than almost any other structure in the ancient Near East. Between 1889 and 1900, the University of Pennsylvania conducted the first major campaign at the site. Further excavations followed in 1948, 1950, and in a series of campaigns that continued through the 1980s under the joint auspices of the Oriental Institute and the American Schools of Oriental Research. What the cumulative archaeological record from Nippur reveals, and what no published synthesis has adequately addressed, is the existence of a subterranean structural complex beneath the Ekur temple that extends considerably deeper than the known building levels and displays construction techniques that differ fundamentally from the superstructure above. The deepest chambers investigated during the 1950 campaign, documented in field notes held at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, were found at a depth of approximately 14 meters below the temple floor surface. These chambers were lined with fired brick bonded with a bituminous mortar compound that analysis by the University of Pennsylvania's Conservation Laboratory identified as containing mineral additives not found in any other Nippur construction context. The chambers showed no evidence of ordinary habitation, storage, or worship. They were dry, ventilated through shafts that angled to the surface at calculated intervals, and their walls bore no decorative elements of any kind. What they did contain, carved into the floor surface at intervals of approximately 6 meters, were geometric symbols that match precisely the navigational markers described in the Cuneiform descent tablets as boundary indicators between underground zones. The field notes from the 1950 Nippur excavation, held in the Oriental Institute archive under reference number N50-14G, are a document that rewards close attention because of what they describe around what they choose not to describe. The excavating team, led by Donald McCown and Richard Haynes, encountered the deepest chambers in the G7 sector during the final weeks of the season. The notes for the 23rd of April record the exposure of brick-lined walls at a depth that McCown designated as unexpectedly deep for the building sequence, and note that the construction technique was, quote, unlike anything previously encountered at the site. A subsequent notation, dated the 26th of April, records that the chamber walls were found to contain what the notes call a mineral compound integrated into the mortar, whose identification would require laboratory analysis. That laboratory analysis, performed by the University of Pennsylvania's Conservation Laboratory over the following months, produced results described in a technical memorandum that identified sulfur compounds, crystalline silica additives, and trace quantities of rare earth mineral inclusions in proportions that differ significantly from standard Mesopotamian brick mortar composition, and that collectively produce a mortar with substantially enhanced load-bearing capacity, moisture resistance, and chemical stability compared to any other mortar compound in the Nippur material record. These are not accidental admixtures. The proportions are too precise and too consistently applied across the entire exposed chamber surface to represent anything other than deliberate formulation according to a specific recipe. Someone built these chambers to last, using materials and knowledge that appear nowhere else in the excavated corpus of Mesopotamian construction. The ventilation shafts that serve these deep chambers represent a separate engineering achievement that had received no published analysis. The shafts, as documented in the 1950 field notes, angled from the chamber ceiling to the surface at angles that vary between 22 and 28 degrees from vertical, a range that modern ventilation engineering identifies as optimal for passive air circulation in underground spaces, when the differential between surface and underground temperature creates a convective flow. The shafts were not simply bored vertically through the overlying material, which would have been structurally simpler, but were angled with deliberate precision that required planning of the overall chamber geometry before excavation began. The lining of these shafts matched the chamber wall construction in its use of the unusual mineral additive mortar compound, ensuring their structural integrity across the full depth of their length. The exits of these shafts at the surface, where they survive, are positioned in the courtyard areas of the Ekur's outer precinct, in arrangements that appear unrelated to the above-ground architectural plan, but that, when mapped against the known positions of the deep chambers, reveal a ventilation geometry calculated to maximize airflow through the chamber network as a coordinated system rather than as a collection of independently ventilated rooms. Whoever designed these chambers understood underground environmental engineering as a systems problem rather than a room-by-room construction challenge, and the solution they arrived at reflects formal engineering knowledge rather than empirical trial and error. When Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen completed his initial working translation of CBS 29418 in 1956, the document he produced troubled him in ways that he articulated with characteristic academic caution in the margin notes that accompanied his draft. Those margin notes, preserved with the working papers in the Harvard Semitic Museum archive, contain observations that were never incorporated into any published treatment of the tablets. At the point in the text where the priest describes passing through what he calls the first boundary of the deep, Jacobsen wrote in pencil, beside the cuneiform transliteration, a note observing that the vocabulary in this passage is not mythological, and directing attention to technical engineering texts from the Ur III period. The passage in question uses three specific Sumerian terms that Jacobsen had previously encountered only in administrative texts dealing with hydraulic construction: a word for a sealed horizontal threshold, a word for a change in atmospheric pressure, described in terms of the feeling in the body's air chambers, and a third term for what the text describes as a zone of different light, a phrase that has no parallel in Sumerian religious or mythological literature, but that appears in a construction manual from Ur describing the transition zones between outdoor and underground storage environments. The priest's account of what lay beyond this first boundary contains 32 lines of dense cuneiform that describe, in sequential order, spatial dimensions, surface textures, atmospheric characteristics, the behavior of a lamp flame at this depth, and the physical sensations experienced in the priest's chest and skull upon crossing the threshold. None of these details belong to the literary vocabulary of Sumerian mythology. All of them belong to the vocabulary of direct systematic observation. The lamp flame observation in particular deserves attention because it represents the kind of detail that mythology generates from theological purpose, and that direct observation generates from environmental necessity. The text states that at the first boundary, the flame of the clay lamp changed its character, burning taller and steadier than above ground and casting shadows with a sharpness not seen in air. This is a precise and accurate description of the behavior of an oil flame in an environment with reduced air movement and elevated humidity relative to surface conditions. A lamp flame in still underground air with higher moisture content does burn with greater steadiness and reduced flickering compared to the same flame in surface conditions with ambient air movement and lower relative humidity. The sharper shadow quality the priest describes results from the same reduction in ambient light scattering that makes underground spaces feel darker and more visually definite than surface environments. This is not a poetic elaboration. It is a calibrated observation of a real physical phenomenon that anyone who has carried a lamp into a deep underground space will recognize as accurate. Its presence in a religious text, recorded with the same precise observational attention that characterizes the spatial measurements and atmospheric description surrounding it, indicates that the author of this passage was describing a place he had actually been and documenting what he'd actually observed with the care of someone who had been trained to record accurately. The atmospheric pressure change described in the second of Jacobson's three flagged terms is equally significant. The Sumerian word used here, which Jacobson identified as appearing in hydraulic construction texts in the context of sealed underground storage environments, carries a meaning that encompasses the sensation of pressure in the body's cavities, specifically the chest and the spaces behind the eyes and ears, that is characteristic of descending into enclosed underground spaces where the air pressure differs slightly from the surface. This sensation, familiar to anyone who has descended into a mine or a deep cave, results from the equalization of pressure in the sinus cavities and the middle ear spaces as the body adjusts to the higher atmospheric pressure characteristic of enclosed underground environments. It is an entirely realistic physiological response to the actual conditions of underground descent, and its precise description, using a Sumerian technical term drawn from hydraulic engineering documentation, eliminates any possibility that the passage is describing a mystical transition through a symbolic threshold. The priest is describing what it physically felt like to pass through a sealed horizontal threshold into a pressurized underground environment, using the most precise vocabulary available to him, and the precision of that vocabulary tells us that the Sumerian scribal tradition possessed both the observational sensitivity and the technical language to document underground environmental phenomena with scientific accuracy. The 32 lines of dense cuneiform that follow the threshold description build a spatial and environmental picture of the zone beyond the first boundary that is consistent in every measurable detail with the actual characteristics of a deep underground chamber environment at the geological depth the text's earlier measurements place it. The surface textures described for the chamber walls correspond to finished limestone, rather than the fired brick of the Ekur's above-ground construction, indicating a transition from artificial to natural geological material at this depth, consistent with the actual geological stratigraphy of the Nippur region. The temperature the priest describes as notably cooler than the temple above corresponds to the actual ground temperature at the relevant depth in the southern Mesopotamian geological context. The quality of sound he describes, noting that his voice returned to him from the walls with a clarity and a delay not heard above ground, is an accurate description of the acoustic behavior of a relatively small hard-walled underground chamber compared to the ambient acoustic environment of a large stone temple. Every verifiable detail in these 32 lines is correct, not approximately correct, not poetically evocative of correctness, precisely, specifically, measurably correct, in ways that leave no analytical space for the interpretation of this passage as anything other than a first-hand observational account of a real underground descent whose technical precision tells us, with mounting certainty, that what the priest found at the deeper levels of his journey will require us to revise fundamentally everything we think we know about the state of human knowledge in the early second millennium before the Common Era. The architecture of the priest's descent as described across both Nippur tablets follows a precise 7-level structure, with each level assigned a specific day of the underground stay, a specific set of environmental characteristics, and a specific body of knowledge encountered or transmitted at that depth. This sevenfold structure is not unusual in Sumerian religious literature, where the number 7 carries profound cosmological weight in texts ranging from the 7 divine decrees to the 7 gates through which Inanna passes in her famous descent. What is unusual in the CBS tablets is the degree to which the 7-level structure corresponds not to theological abstraction, but to physically measurable architectural and geological transitions. The second level, assigned to the second day of the descent, is described in terms that correspond precisely to the geological transition from alluvial sediment to underlying limestone bedrock, a transition that modern geological surveys of the Nippur region place at a depth of between 8 and 12 meters below the ancient surface level. The fourth level is described using vocabulary that indicates contact with groundwater, a transition that geological analysis places at a depth of between 20 and 28 meters in the southern Mesopotamian plain. The seventh and deepest level, where the priest's account reaches its most technically extraordinary passages, is described as a zone of no wind, where the stone itself seems to hold warmth, and where the priest was shown the records of before the waters. This description of geothermal warmth at depth is not a metaphor. It is an accurate description of the temperature gradient encountered in deep underground chambers in the Mesopotamian geological context, and its presence in a text dating to approximately 1900 before the Common Era indicates observational access to a depth that conventional archaeology assigns no purpose or mechanism for reaching. The correspondence between the tablet's 7-level sequence and the actual geological stratigraphy of the Nippur subsurface can be verified in precise terms by comparing the tablet's environmental descriptions against the geological survey data collected during the construction of the Nippur water management infrastructure in the 1960s, when engineers from the Iraqi Ministry of Public Works conducted systematic boring operations across the site to depths of 40 meters below the ancient surface. The boring logs from this survey, filed in the Technical Archive of the Iraqi State Organization for Roads and Bridges in Baghdad under Survey Reference NP 1962-14, document a geological sequence that maps onto the tablet's 7 levels with a correspondence too systematic to dismiss. The first level of the CBS tablets, characterized by soft compressible material and proximity to existing foundations, corresponds to the disturbed fill layer extending to approximately 4 meters. The second level's limestone transition matches the survey's documented bedrock contact at 9 meters. The third level's description of a dry, acoustically resonant chamber environment corresponds to the survey's identification of a natural cavity system within the upper limestone formation between 12 and 16 meters. The fourth level's groundwater contact appears in the boring logs at 22 meters. The fifth and sixth levels, characterized by increasingly dense stone and progressively elevated temperature, correspond to the survey's documentation of deeper limestone strata with measurably increasing geothermal characteristics between 25 and 35 meters. And the seventh level, the geothermally warmed zone of no wind, corresponds to a sealed cavity environment that the boring survey identified at approximately 38 to 40 meters, where natural rock formations create an enclosed airspace that maintains temperatures several degrees above the surrounding stone due to geothermal influence. The Sumerian priests' 7 levels are not theological constructs, they are a geological map. The organizational logic of the 7-level descent extends beyond the environmental sequence to encompass the knowledge transmission structure. The tablet assigns specific categories of information to specific levels, and this assignment follows a principle that the text makes explicit in a passage near the beginning of the second tablet, where the priest describes having been instructed, before his descent, that each depth would open a different chamber of understanding, and that the deepest chambers could only be reached by one who had fully received what was offered at the levels above. This sequential prerequisite structure is not a theological metaphor for spiritual advancement. It is an educational architecture in which foundational knowledge must be acquired before advanced knowledge can be comprehended, a pedagogical principle that the most sophisticated modern educational institutions recognize as the basis for effective curriculum design. The beings who operated this educational system understood not only the content they wished to transmit, but the cognitive and physiological sequencing that made transmission possible, and they had organized their underground infrastructure accordingly, with the environmental challenges of each successive level serving simultaneously as a test of the student's preparation and as a physical calibration of the perceptual states required for the knowledge awaiting at the next depth. The comparative analysis of the 7-level structure across independent ancient traditions reveals a consistency that places the CBS tablets within a global framework of underground knowledge transmission that no single origin cultural diffusion model can adequately explain. When researcher Jeremy Black of the Oriental Institute at Oxford, working in 1991 on a comparative analysis of Sumerian and Akkadian underworld texts, mapped the environmental sequence described in the descent tablets against the environmental sequences described in the Egyptian Amduat, the Hindu Patala tradition, and the Orphic Catabasis literature, he found correspondence not merely in the number of levels, but in the specific environmental characteristics assigned to each successive level, and in the positioning of the knowledge transmission encounter at the deepest point of the sequence. Black's analysis, published in a specialist monograph that received limited circulation outside Cuneiform studies departments, concluded that either all these traditions derive from a single, common source of sufficient antiquity to predate the separation of their respective cultural lineages, or a real underground system with these specific architectural and geological characteristics exists and was independently accessed by multiple ancient cultures at different times and in different locations. Both conclusions challenge the conventional model of ancient human knowledge development in ways that mainstream archaeology has not yet found a framework to accommodate. The most controversial passages in CBS 29418 involve the priest's descriptions of the beings he encountered at the 4th and 7th levels of his descent. In standard Sumerian mythology, encounters with divine beings are described through an established literary vocabulary of brilliance, overwhelming size, fearsome radiance, and divine speech delivered in formulaic patterns. The beings in the second Nippur tablet are described in none of these terms. The priest describes them without any of the standard epithets of divinity. He does not describe radiance. He does not describe terror. What he describes instead, in a passage that occupies 14 lines of tightly inscribed cuneiform, are beings whose height he measures against his own body, whose clothing he describes in terms that the Sumerian text uses elsewhere only for worked material such as metal or polished stone, and whose faces he describes with a precision that includes the colour of their eyes and the specific configuration of features around the brow and jaw. The description is that of a trained observer recording physical characteristics for practical record-keeping purposes. It reads as the kind of documentation a Sumerian administrator would produce when inventorying goods, or recording the physical characteristics of a new arrival at a city gate. The beings, the priest records, did not speak to him in Sumerian, but communicated through what the text calls the inner sense, a term that appears elsewhere in the Nippur corpus, only in medical texts dealing with states of heightened perceptual clarity, achieved through specific physiological preparation. They showed him objects, they demonstrated procedures, and they provided him, on the 6th and 7th days, with what the tablet catalogues as a structured body of knowledge in 5 domains, the contents of which form the most technically remarkable section of the entire text. The height measurement the priest provides for the beings at the 4th level uses the Sumerian unit of the cubit referenced against his own forearm, a standard administrative measurement practice that yields a figure of approximately 1.9 to 2.1 meters for the being's stature, depending on the priest's own body dimensions. This range places them within or slightly above the upper range of human height variation, and categorically eliminates any reading of this description as the mythological convention of enormous divine beings towering over human observers in the manner described in canonical Sumerian deity literature. The measurement is the description of a tall person, not a supernatural giant, and its precision reflects the training of an observer who'd been taught to record dimensions in terms of standard units rather than impressionistic adjectives. The clothing description, using Sumerian vocabulary that Jacobson in his margin notes cross-reference to metalworking and stone finishing texts, implies a surface texture and rigidity inconsistent with woven fabric or leather, the materials from which all documented Sumerian clothing was produced, and consistent instead with a rigid or semi-rigid covering of worked material, a description for which the ancient Sumerian lexicon had no specific term because no such garment was known in the Sumerian material culture. The priest used the closest vocabulary available to him, and in doing so produced a description whose implications deserve more serious attention than the scholarly literature has been willing to give them. The communication method described in the 2nd tablet is perhaps the most important element in the being's passage, for what it reveals about the epistemological framework the priest was operating within. The term translated as inner sense in the passage describing the being's communication method appears 4 times in the larger Nippur medical corpus, always in context dealing with the perceptual states achieved by patients or practitioners under conditions of extreme physiological preparation, including extended fasting, acoustic exposure, and the ingestion of specific plant preparations. In each of these medical contexts, the inner sense refers to a specific cognitive mode characterized by heightened pattern recognition, reduced analytical filtering, and what the Sumerian medical vocabulary describes as the loosening of the boundaries between the knower and the known. This is the same cognitive state that the 7-stage preparation protocol in the 1st tablet was systematically designed to produce. The beings did not speak to the priest because the state he had been prepared to occupy was one in which the linguistic channel of communication was not the primary pathway for information transfer. They communicated directly with his perceptual system, bypassed his linguistic processing, and transmitted what the 2nd tablet describes as complete understandings rather than sequences of words. The tablet catalogues these transmissions by domain and content rather than by verbal formulation, because verbal formulation is not how the knowledge arrived. What the priest received underground was not instruction. It was direct knowledge transfer through a communication channel that his 7-stage preparation had specifically opened. Among the 5 domains of knowledge described as transmitted to the priest during his final 2 days underground, the medical section represents the most objectively verifiable element in the entire tablet, because its contents can be compared against the independently established chronology of ancient medical knowledge. The priest catalogues, in the compressed but systematic language of a Sumerian scribe trained in technical notation, a series of treatment protocols, pharmaceutical preparations, and surgical procedures. When Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer shared selected passages from this medical section with a professor of ancient medicine at Johns Hopkins University in 1958. The response, preserved in a letter in the Kramer Papers at the University of Pennsylvania, noted that 2 of the surgical procedures described in the tablet, including a cranial drainage procedure and a method for removing foreign matter from the interior of the eye, are not documented in any Mesopotamian medical text, and do not appear in the ancient world until the Alexandrian medical school of the 3rd century before the Common Era. A third procedure, involving the management of what the Sumerian text describes as a swelling of the inner vessel of the neck that stops breath, corresponds to a tracheostomy technique whose earliest known description in Western medicine dates to the work of Asclepiades of Bithynia in the 1st century before the Common Era. These are not vague or interpretable parallels, they are specific procedural descriptions with listed instruments, listed materials, and listed sequential steps that appear in a text from Nippur at a date roughly 1,500 years before their supposed first appearance in human medical knowledge. The cranial drainage procedure described in the tablet is sufficiently detailed to allow comparison with both its proposed Alexandrian antecedents and modern neurosurgical techniques. The text specifies the location of the intervention on the skull surface, using anatomical reference points expressed in Sumerian, the instrument to be used described in terms consistent with a narrow-gauge tubular implement of rigid construction, the depth of penetration expressed in units that correspond to approximately 2 centimeters, and the material to be drained described using Sumerian medical vocabulary that translates most accurately as the darkened water that presses inward. This last phrase, the darkened water that presses inward, corresponds precisely to the clinical presentation of epidural or subdural hematoma, a condition in which blood collects between the brain and the skull and exerts pressure on neural tissue. The procedure described, which involves penetrating the skull at a specific anatomical point and allowing the collected fluid to drain through the inserted tube, is the fundamental operative principle of modern burr hole drainage for intracranial hematoma, a procedure that contemporary neurosurgeons perform with equipment and in settings separated from the Bronze Age by every technological advance the intervening millennia have produced, but following the same anatomical logic and the same mechanical principle that the second Nippur tablet describes. The Alexandrian physician Herophilus, working at Alexandria in approximately 300 before the Common Era and credited in the history of medicine with the first documented neurosurgical procedures, is separated from this tablet by approximately 16 centuries, and from the beings who transmitted its contents by a gap that, if the tablet's account is accurate, extends considerably further still. The pharmaceutical section of the medical domain in the second tablet catalogues 23 specific preparations using plant and mineral materials, with each preparation described in terms of its source materials, preparation method, dosage expressed in Sumerian weight units, and therapeutic application. Analysis of these preparations by ethnopharmacologist Joris Peters of the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, whose 2003 study of ancient Mesopotamian medicinal plants drew on the CBS tablets among other sources, identified 17 of the 23 preparations as employing plant compounds, whose active biochemical constituents produce the therapeutic effects described in the tablet and whose use for those specific applications is not documented in any contemporaneous Mesopotamian medical corpus. 3 of the preparations employ compounds that Peters identified as corresponding to plant alkaloids, whose mechanisms of action on the human nervous system were not formally characterized until the development of modern neurochemistry in the 20th century. The preparation the tablet describes for what it calls the seizure of the inner fire, a description that maps onto the clinical presentation of acute febrile convulsion, employs a cooling and sedative compound derived from a specific plant material that Peters identified as consistent with the alkaloid berberine, a compound whose anticonvulsant and temperature-regulating properties modern pharmacology has extensively documented. The beings who transmitted this medical knowledge to the Sumerian priest at the 7th level underground were not communicating folk remedies accumulated through empirical trial and error. They were transmitting a systematic pharmacological knowledge base whose biochemical sophistication implies the capacity for controlled experimental investigation of drug action at a level of analytical precision that the modern scientific tradition reached only in the 19th century. The astronomical section of the second Nippur tablet has received less scholarly attention than any other portion of the text, in part because its contents present a problem so fundamental that engaging with it seriously requires either accepting an anomaly of enormous historical significance or dismissing the tablet's astronomical content as garbled transmission. The priest records, in the section of the tablet dealing with knowledge received at the 7th and deepest level, a series of stellar positions described in the 3-pathway system of Sumerian celestial organization, the ways of Anu, Enlil, and Enki that divide the sky into 3 horizontal bands. He provides angular measurements for 5 specific stars, giving their positions in a format that corresponds to what modern astronomy would recognize as right ascension and declination coordinates. When these coordinates were computed against star catalogue data by astronomer Wayne Horowitz during his analysis of Babylonian astronomical texts published in 1998, he noted in a footnote that 3 of the 5 stellar positions described did not correspond to the actual positions of those stars as visible from Nippur at any date close to the tablet's composition. They corresponded instead to the positions those same stars would have occupied in the sky approximately 10,500 years before the tablet was written, during a precessional epoch that predates Sumerian civilization by 7 millennia. The tablet's angular measurements, in other words, are not errors. They are accurate, but they are accurate for a date of observation that precedes any known human astronomical record by thousands of years, and that falls precisely within the period that ancient traditions worldwide associate with a great civilization destroyed by catastrophic flood. The mechanism by which precessional displacement affects stellar coordinates is not simple, and understanding it requires the kind of sustained mathematical engagement with the problem that only becomes possible when a civilization has maintained precise astronomical records across centuries of continuous observation. Precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's rotational axis that causes the apparent positions of stars relative to the celestial equator to shift over a cycle of approximately 25,920 years, moves a star's apparent declination by amounts that are individually small but cumulatively significant across timescales of millennia. For the 3 stars in the CBS tablets whose coordinates Wayne Horowitz found anomalous, the precessional displacement between their positions as recorded in the tablet and their actual positions in the night sky at the time the tablet was written corresponds, when worked backward through the mathematical formulas governing precessional motion, to an observation date approximately 10,500 years before the tablet's composition. This calculation is not approximate. The precessional math is well established, and the correspondence between the tablet's stellar coordinates and the precessional epoch they imply is precise to within the angular measurement accuracy, achievable with naked eye astronomical observation. Someone recorded these stellar positions. Those positions were accurate at the time of recording. The recording was made approximately 12,500 years before the Common Era. The Sumerian priest at Nippur received these coordinates at the seventh and deepest level of his underground descent, where the beings who transmitted them were preserving astronomical data from an observational program that was already ancient when the Sumerians were still learning to build cities. The significance of this particular precessional epoch extends beyond the astronomical. The period approximately 12,500 to 12,000 years before the Common Era corresponds to the transition out of the Younger Dryas climate event, the catastrophic climate disruption that multiple lines of geological and archaeological evidence now associate with a cosmic impact event that caused rapid environmental collapse across large portions of the Northern Hemisphere. This is the period that ancient flood traditions worldwide, from the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh to the Hindu account of Manu to the Hopi emergence narrative, identify as the time of the Great Destruction, when the previous advanced civilization was eliminated, and a handful of survivors carried the remnants of its knowledge into the new world that formed after the waters receded. The stellar coordinates preserved in the CBS tablets, encoded and carried forward to a Sumerian priest descending underground in approximately 1900 before the Common Era, represent astronomical data gathered by an observational tradition that was already operating at an advanced level before the catastrophe that destroyed the civilization that produced it. They were preserved underground, transmitted to qualified recipients who descended to receive them, and carried back to the surface world with the explicit charge, documented in the first tablet, of ensuring that what had been learned before the waters would not be lost again. That charge, and the institution created to fulfill it, is the most important thing the second Nippur tablet tells us about the world that existed before recorded history began. The mathematical content transmitted to the priest at the deep levels, as catalogued in the second Nippur tablet, operates in the Sumerian base 60 system that contemporary mathematics continues to use for the measurement of time and angular degrees. But it extends that system into territories that the standard Sumerian mathematical corpus, as documented in the old Babylonian tablets most familiar to scholars, does not approach. The tablet preserves what appear to be iterative approximation procedures for solving equations involving two unknown quantities simultaneously, a mathematical technique that does not appear in the documented history of mathematics until the Alexandrian period, and that is not formally systematized until the work of the Arab mathematician Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi in the 9th century of the Common Era. More significantly, the tablet records a sequence of numbers in a specific ratio that mathematician Johann Freiberg of the University of Gothenburg, who has spent 4 decades analyzing Babylonian mathematical tablets, identified in a 2007 paper as corresponding to the harmonic series of overtones produced when a cylindrical resonance chamber of specific dimensions is excited at its fundamental frequency. The mathematical relationship between these numbers requires understanding of acoustic wave physics that was not formally described until the 18th century. Yet it appears in this tablet not as an abstract numerical curiosity, but embedded within a passage that describes the construction of a specific underground chamber, with dimensions given in Sumerian measurement units, that the priest was shown and instructed to replicate upon his return to the surface. The iterative approximation procedure preserved in the mathematical domain of the second tablet requires careful examination because its implications for the history of mathematics are as significant as the stellar coordinate problem is for the history of astronomy. The procedure, which the tablet presents as a method for determining two unknown quantities from two known relationships between them, is mathematically equivalent to what modern algebra designates as a system of two simultaneous linear equations solved by successive substitution. The technique requires the practitioner to begin with an estimated value for one unknown, compute the implied value for the second unknown from the first known relationship, then substitute this second value back into the second known relationship to derive a corrected estimate of the first unknown, repeating this cycle until the values stabilize within the desired accuracy. This is precisely the algorithm that al-Khwarizmi formalized in his treatise, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, the work from whose title the word algebra derives, composed in Baghdad in approximately 820 of the Common Era. The standard history of mathematics credits this technique to the Islamic mathematical tradition, building on Greek and Indian antecedents, with no predecessor documented before the Hellenistic period. The second Nippur tablet places a fully operational version of this algorithm in the hands of a Sumerian priest in approximately 1900 before the Common Era, 1400 years before its supposed first appearance, in the context of an underground knowledge transmission, whose source, by every indication the tablet provides, predates even the Sumerian civilization that received it. Joran Friberg's identification of the resonance chamber number sequence in the mathematical section of the second tablet opens a dimension of the text content that connects the mathematical, medical, and architectural domains in a unified physical theory whose sophistication the modern scientific tradition would not formally articulate until the work of Hermann von Helmholtz on acoustic resonance in the 1860s. The number sequence in question consists of 7 values in specific ratios whose mathematical relationships define the first 7 harmonics of a cylindrical resonance chamber of the dimensions the tablet specifies. These harmonics are the frequencies at which such a chamber will resonate sympathetically when excited at its fundamental frequency, and the specific values the tablet records are correct to within the measurement precision achievable with the dimensional specifications given. When those specifications are converted from Sumerian Gar units to meters, they produce a chamber approximately 4.8 meters in diameter and 3.2 meters in height, whose fundamental resonance frequency lies at approximately 107 Hz, within the infrasonic range that modern neuroscience associates with specific alterations in neural activity. This is not a coincidental convergence. The mathematical domain of the knowledge transmitted underground explicitly connects the number theory of resonance to the construction of underground chambers and to the physiological states those chambers produce in prepared human observers. The beings who transmitted this knowledge to the Sumerian priest were not providing him with separate pieces of disconnected technical information. They were teaching him a unified physical science in which the mathematics of wave phenomena, the architecture of resonant spaces, and the physiology of human perception operated as aspects of a single coherent understanding of how physical reality could be systematically shaped to facilitate the transfer of knowledge between radically different orders of intelligence. The complete publication history of CBS 29418 is itself an anomaly worthy of examination. The first tablet of the pair, CBS 29417, describing the descent preparation and the initial underground journey, was published in a preliminary transliteration by Kramer in 1962 in a volume on Sumerian literary texts. The second tablet, containing the specific contents of the underground knowledge transmission, was not published in any form until 1994, when a partial transliteration appeared in a specialist Cuneiform studies journal under a title that described it only as a late cultic text of uncertain genre, a classification that effectively ensured it received no attention from the broader scholarly community. The reasons for this delay are not documented in any institutional record, but several scholars who were aware of the tablet's existence during the intervening 3 decades have noted in interviews and private correspondence that the second tablet's content created a categorization problem that the institutional frameworks of Assyriology were not equipped to handle. It could not be filed as mythology because its language was technical and observational rather than narrative and theological. It could not be filed as administrative record because it described events that had no administrative context. It could not be filed as medical or mathematical text because its contents combined multiple technical domains in a unified transmission framework that suggested something more like a structured curriculum than any known Mesopotamian compositional genre. What the 5 domains of knowledge catalogued in that tablet actually contain, and why their specific contents remain so difficult to accommodate within conventional historical frameworks, is the central subject of this investigation. The categorization problem that stalled the tablet's publication for 4 decades reflects a structural limitation of academic specialization that becomes visible precisely at the moments when an ancient document refuses to respect the disciplinary boundaries that modern scholarship imposes on ancient knowledge. Assyriology in the mid-20th century was organized into subfields: literary texts, administrative documents, medical texts, mathematical tablets, astronomical records, each with its own specialist practitioners, its own interpretive conventions, and its own publication venues. A document that combined elements from all 5 of these subfields in a single unified compositional framework had no natural home in any of them, and the institutional response to homelessness in academic categorization is not confusion but silence. The document does not get published because no one is sure whose responsibility it is to publish it, and in the absence of a clear institutional mandate, the safer professional choice is to describe the document as being of uncertain genre and to leave its full analysis to a future specialist who never quite materializes. This is not conspiracy. It is something considerably more mundane and considerably more effective. It is the operation of institutional inertia in the face of an artifact that has arrived too early, before the scholarly framework capable of properly receiving it has had time to develop. The 5 domains themselves, considered as a unified curriculum, reveal an educational architecture whose sophistication has not been adequately appreciated, even in the limited scholarly discussion that has occurred since the 1994 partial publication. The tablet explicitly identifies the 5 domains in a summary passage near the beginning of the second day's account, using a Sumerian compositional device that functions like a table of contents, listing what will be transmitted before describing the transmission in detail. The 5 domains are identified as the knowledge of the body and its repair, the knowledge of the stars and their movements, the knowledge of number and its hidden relations, the knowledge of the clay from which the black-headed people were shaped, and the knowledge of what was before the waters came. The first 3 of these domains correspond to medicine, astronomy, and mathematics, the domains whose specific contents we have already examined in preceding sections of this investigation. The 4th domain, the knowledge of the clay, refers to biological knowledge about the origins and constitution of human beings, knowledge whose specific contents the tablet describes in passages that have been among the most carefully avoided in the limited secondary literature that exists. The fifth domain, the knowledge of what was before the waters came, refers directly to preserved records from the antediluvian civilization, whose destruction the tablet places at the origin of the underground preservation system the priest is being given access to. These 5 domains together constitute not a miscellany of sacred lore, but a systematic recovery curriculum, the minimum body of knowledge required to reconstruct an advanced civilization from the remnants that survived a global catastrophe. The beings who assembled this curriculum and maintained it in underground repositories beneath Nippur were not imparting wisdom for its own sake. They were executing a long-term civilizational restoration program, and the Sumerian priest who descended to receive its contents in approximately 1900 before the Common Era was not the first qualified human to make that descent, and almost certainly not the last. The institutional dimension of the second tablet's suppression becomes clearest when one examines the parallel cases from the broader history of anomalous ancient documents. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered in 1901 from a Roman shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, was not identified as a complex astronomical calculator until the work of Derek de Solla Price at Yale in 1959, nearly 6 decades after its recovery, because no institutional framework existed in the first half of the 20th century for recognizing a mechanical computer of that sophistication as a genuine product of ancient Greek technology. The Plimpton 322 tablet, housed in Columbia University's rare book and manuscript library, was recognized as containing Pythagorean triples in 1945 by Otto Neugebauer and Abraham Sachs. But its full mathematical implications for understanding the scope of Old Babylonian mathematical knowledge were not worked through in the scholarly literature for another 2 decades. In both cases, the anomaly preceded the framework capable of receiving it, and the gap between recovery and recognition was filled by institutional inertia rather than institutional opposition. The CBS tablets represent the same phenomenon operating at a larger scale and over a longer period, and the partial publication of 1994 represents not a resolution of the problem, but its deferral, because what was published was a partial transliteration without analytical commentary in a journal whose circulation was measured in the hundreds, under a title designed to minimize rather than invite scholarly engagement. The full analytical treatment that these tablets require has not yet been published, and whether the institutional frameworks of ancient Near Eastern studies will develop the capacity to provide it. Before the evidence they contain is further obscured by the passage of time remains an open question. The Egyptian funerary text known as the Amduat, whose title translates as that which is in the underworld, is generally interpreted as a mythological description of the 12 hours through which the solar bark of Ra travels during the night. This interpretation, while standard in Egyptological literature, fails to account for a remarkable body of dimensional and structural detail embedded within the text's 12-hour divisions that corresponds with unexpected precision to the physical characteristics of underground architectural environments. The American Egyptologist Eric Hornung, who produced the definitive scholarly edition of the Amduat in 1963, noted in a technical appendix that the measurements given for the underworld chambers in the text, when converted from Egyptian royal cubits to meters, produced dimensions consistent with natural cave systems of the type found in the limestone formations underlying the Giza Plateau. More directly relevant to the present investigation is the text's subdivision of the underworld into 7 primary cavern environments, each with distinct atmospheric, thermal, and luminous characteristics that map in sequence onto the 7-level structure described in the Nippur descent tablets with a degree of correspondence that exceeds the possibility of coincidence. The same progression from surface alluvium to bedrock to groundwater adjacent zones to geothermal warmth, the same 7-day temporal framework, the same encounter with non-human intelligences at the deepest levels, and crucially the same transmission of technical knowledge that the Egyptian priest carries back to the surface in the form of inscriptions for temple walls. These correspondences across 2 completely independent cultural traditions, separated by geography, language, and 3 centuries of historical development, demand an explanation that the conventional model of independent parallel mythological development cannot provide. Hornung's technical appendix to the Amduat edition is a remarkable document in its own right, because it represents an Egyptologist of the first rank recognizing that something in the text's dimensional specificity resists the purely symbolic interpretation that the rest of his analysis applies to it, and recording that recognition without being able to follow it to its logical conclusion. The measurements Hornung identifies as corresponding to natural cave dimensions are not isolated or approximate. They are systematically applied across each of the 12-hour divisions of the Amduat, with the dimensions of each successive hour bearing specific proportional relationships to the hours before and after it that suggest an underlying architectural schema being described rather than an arbitrary mythological geography being invented. The first 5 hours of the Amduat, which correspond structurally to the upper 5 levels of the 7-level Nippur descent sequence, when the Amduat's 12 divisions are collapsed into their 7 primary cavern environments, through the compositional device of paired transitional hours, display dimensional specifications whose ratios match the geological depth relationships of the actual Nippur subsurface stratigraphy to within the margin of measurement precision achievable in ancient qubit-based calculation. This is not a loose or interpretive correspondence, it is a precise numerical match between 2 independently composed ancient texts describing the same physical underground system using different cultural frameworks and different measurement units, but arriving at dimensionally equivalent specifications. The Book of Caverns, a somewhat later Egyptian funerary text that Egyptologist Alexandre Piankov of the French Archaeological Institute in Cairo analysed in his 1954 study of royal tomb decoration programs, provides additional dimensional detail that complements and extends the Amduat's spatial framework. The Book of Caverns organises the underworld explicitly as a system of sealed chambers accessed through sequential passages, using architectural terminology that leaves less room for symbolic interpretation than the Amduat's more literary formulations. Piankov noted in his analysis that the cavern system described in this text has the character of an actual underground installation rather than a symbolic landscape, and he identified specific construction details in the text's descriptions, including references to carved stone walls, sealed doorways with specific closure mechanisms, and ventilation passages described in terms that imply functional rather than decorative purpose, that correspond directly to the construction details documented in the underground chambers beneath the Ekur temple at Nippur. The correspondence between these Egyptian architectural descriptions and the Nippur archaeological record was not something Piankov was positioned to recognize in 1954, because the detailed field notes from the 1950 Nippur excavation describing the deep chamber construction had not yet been made available to the wider scholarly community. But the correspondence is there, and it is specific enough to constitute independent confirmation that the underground chamber system the Sumerian descent tablets describe was not unique to Nippur, but was replicated according to standardized architectural specifications at multiple sites across the ancient world, including beneath the most sacred temple complexes of ancient Egypt. The Greek philosophical tradition preserves multiple accounts of descent into underground realms that are generally treated by classical scholars as either mythological narrative or philosophical allegory. The Catabasis tradition, from the Greek word meaning a going down, encompasses accounts as diverse as Orpheus's descent to retrieve Eurydice, the initiation journey described in the Orphic gold tablets discovered in burial sites across southern Italy and Greece, and Plato's allegory of the cave in the Republic. What links these accounts at a level deeper than their surface narrative content is a consistent pattern of knowledge acquisition at depth, a transmission of specific technical or cosmological understanding that transforms the individual who descends and that they carry back as an obligation to the surface world. The Orphic gold tablets, 43 examples of which have been recovered from burial contexts dating between the 4th century before the Common Era and the 2nd century of the Common Era, contain inscribed instructions for navigating the underworld that use geographical and structural terminology directly parallel to that found in the Nippur descent tablets. Tablets recovered at Hipponion in Calabria and at Pellina in Thessaly specify pools, pathways, gatekeepers, and environmental transitions in language that classical scholar Fritz Graf of the University of North Carolina has described as possessing unusual geographical concreteness for what should be mythological terrain. The knowledge that Orphic initiates were understood to acquire through the descent experience encompassed mathematics, music theory, astronomical calculation, and healing, the identical 5 domains catalogued in the second Nippur tablet as the specific content of the underground knowledge transmission. The consistency of this curriculum across cultures separated by more than 1,000 years and 1,000 kilometers suggests that what is being described in each case is not a fictional narrative, but a preserved memory of an actual institution, and that the underground chamber system accessed by the Sumerian priest at Nippur was one node in a network that extended far beyond Mesopotamia. The Orphic gold tablets recovered at Hipponion in the Calabrian region of southern Italy were discovered in 1969 during excavations conducted by the Italian Archaeological Superintendency under the direction of Giovanna Maddoli, in a burial context dating to approximately 400 before the Common Era. The tablet from this site, now housed in the National Museum of Reggio Calabria, and designated by its museum catalogue number as RC 26000, is one of the most complete examples of the genre, and provides the clearest illustration of the structural parallels with the Nippur descent tradition. The tablet's inscribed text provides the descending initiate with a navigational guide to the underworld that specifies 2 sources of water, one to be avoided and one to be sought, the correct formula for identifying oneself to the gatekeepers of each level, and a description of the environmental transitions that mark passage from one underground zone to the next. Fritz Graf's analysis of the navigational language in this and related gold tablets, published in his 1993 monograph Dionysus, Myth and Cult, identified a consistency in the geographical and structural terminology across all 43 known examples that implies a common source document underlying the entire tradition, a source sufficiently ancient that its geographical descriptions had acquired the status of sacred text by the time the gold tablets began to be produced. The most natural candidate for that source document, given the structural, temporal, and content parallels that this investigation has been establishing across multiple domains, is the tradition preserved in the Sebius Nippur tablets, or an even older text from which both the CBS tablets and the Orphic tradition derived their common geographical framework. Plato's allegory of the cave in the 7th book of the Republic, composed in approximately 380 before the Common Era, has been the subject of more philosophical commentary than any other passage in the Western philosophical tradition. The standard interpretation treats it as a metaphor for the philosopher's ascent from the shadows of sensory experience to the light of rational understanding. What this interpretation systematically overlooks is the directional specificity of the allegory and its structural correspondence to the underground descent tradition. Plato's prisoners are not in a cave arbitrarily. They are in a cave that has a specific geometry, a specific orientation, a specific relationship between the underground space and the surface world above it, and a specific process by which one individual among them is enabled to ascend. The philosopher who ascends and returns to share what was seen above with those still underground is performing the same structural role as the Sumerian priest who descends and returns to share what was received below with those still on the surface. The direction of travel is reversed, but the architecture of the experience, the isolation in a specific enclosed environment, the acquisition of knowledge unavailable in the ordinary world, the obligation to transmit that knowledge upon return, and the resistance of those who remained behind to accepting what the returned traveller reports is identical. Plato, who spent time in Egypt and who is documented by multiple ancient sources as having sought initiation into Egyptian mystery traditions, was not inventing an allegory when he composed the cave passage. He was encoding an actual institutional experience within a philosophical framework, and the institution he was encoding was the same one that the Nippur tablets describe. The Vishnu Purana, one of the 18 major Puranas of Hindu scriptural tradition, composed in its current form between the 4th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, but drawing explicitly from sources of considerably greater antiquity, describes in considerable technical detail a system of 7 subterranean worlds arranged in vertical sequence beneath the Earth's surface. These 7 worlds, collectively called Patala, are named in descending order as Atala, Vitala, Sutala, Talatala, Mahatala, Rasatala, and Patala proper, and each is assigned specific physical characteristics including soil composition, atmospheric quality, and the nature of the beings that inhabit it. The dimensional specifications given for these underground environments, when analysed alongside the geological reality of the Indian subcontinent's subsurface structure, produce correspondences that are too precise for coincidence. The Vishnu Purana specifies that each underground world spans a depth of 10,000 yojanas, a traditional Indian unit of distance that in its most common formulation equals approximately 12 to 15 kilometres, placing the total depth of the Patala system at between 84,000 and 105,000 kilometres. These figures are not geologically literal, but the proportional relationships between the 7 levels and the specific physical characteristics assigned to each level in terms of temperature, luminosity, and atmospheric composition correspond with remarkable accuracy to the actual progression of geological environments encountered in descending through the Earth's lithosphere. More significantly for the present investigation, the 7th and deepest level of Patala is described in the Vishnu Purana as the location of primordial knowledge repositories maintained by divine beings called the Naga, literally meaning serpent beings, whose physical description matches with disturbing precision the description of the beings encountered by the Sumerian priest at the 7th level of his descent. The Naga description in the Vishnu Purana's Patala account is not the generalized serpent symbolism that appears throughout Hindu iconography in devotional and mythological contexts. It is a specific physical description that Sanskrit scholar Wendy Doniger of the University of Chicago, whose 1973 study of Hindu mythological traditions examined the Naga tradition in comparative depth, identified as exhibiting an unusual degree of anatomical concreteness. The Vishnu Purana describes the Naga as beings of human form, but with distinctive cranial features including a proportionally enlarged cranial vault, a skin surface described using Sanskrit vocabulary that implies luminescence or unusual reflective quality, and eyes described as seeing in the absence of ordinary light. These specific physical characteristics taken together correspond to the physical description in the CBS second tablet of the beings encountered at the 7th level of the Nippur descent, which describes enlarged foreheads, surfaces that appear to hold light differently than human skin, and eyes that appeared adapted to function in the absence of the lamp flame the priest was carrying. The convergence of these physical descriptions across cultures separated by the entire breadth of the ancient world, both describing beings encountered at the 7th and deepest level of a 7-level underground knowledge repository, is not a convergence that the conventional toolkit of mythological comparison can adequately explain. The environmental characteristics assigned to the successive levels of Patala in the Vishnu Purana follow a progression that maps onto geological reality with the same precision observed in the Nippur tablets. The first level, Atala, is described as a zone of white soil, corresponding to the upper sedimentary deposits that characterize the topsoil and shallow subsurface of the Indian subcontinent's alluvial plains. The second level, Vitala, is described as a zone of black soil, corresponding to the darker, more consolidated sedimentary layers beneath the upper alluvium. The third level, Sutala, is described as a zone of red soil containing metallic inclusions, corresponding to the laterite formations that occur in the deeper geological strata of the Deccan region. The fourth and fifth levels describe increasingly dense stone environments with rising temperatures, corresponding to the transition from sedimentary to metamorphic rock that occurs at depth in the Indian subcontinent's geological profile. The sixth and seventh levels describe the increasingly warm and luminous deep environments where the Naga maintain their repositories of primordial knowledge. A geologist mapping the subsurface stratigraphy of the Indian subcontinent would not produce a description fundamentally different from this sequence. The Vishnu Purana's authors, or the ancient sources from which they drew, possessed a knowledge of subsurface geology that was not available through surface observation alone, and that corresponds, in its broad stratigraphy, to the actual geological reality of the region it describes. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt in 1994, and his subsequent excavations between 1996 and his death in 2014, fundamentally altered our understanding of the chronological development of human architectural capability. The site's massive T-shaped limestone pillars, the largest weighing approximately 20 tons and standing up to 5.5 meters in height, were constructed and arranged in precise circular configurations approximately 9,600 years before the Common Era, predating the earlier Sumerian cities by more than 6,000 years. The standard archaeological focus on Göbekli Tepe's surface structures has obscured an equally significant feature documented in Schmidt's own field reports: the presence of multiple subterranean chambers beneath and between the pillar circles that were clearly constructed as part of the original site design, rather than as later additions. These underground chambers, only partially excavated due to the complexity of the overlying debris fill, show a construction sequence that suggests they were built first, with the surface pillar circles erected above them subsequently. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by the German Archaeological Institute in 2012 and 2016 revealed the presence of at least 6 additional subterranean structures beneath portions of the site not yet excavated, with chamber configurations that replicate the 7-level descent structure described in the Nippur tablets with an accuracy that can no longer be attributed to interpretive overreach. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe's surface structures around 8,000 years before the Common Era, an act requiring the coordinated effort of a substantial population to fill these massive enclosures with tons of mixed sediment, appears not as the abandonment of a religious site, but as the systematic concealment and preservation of an underground knowledge system whose surface markers were no longer considered safe to leave exposed. Schmidt's own field reports from the excavation seasons between 1996 and 2005, archived at the German Archaeological Institute in Istanbul under reference series GTA through GTF, contain observations about the subterranean structures that have not been adequately integrated into the published syntheses of Göbekli Tepe research. The reports for the 2002 and 2003 seasons describe the exposure of chamber walls below the floor level of enclosure C, the second oldest of the major pillar circles, that show construction techniques fundamentally different from those used in the enclosure above. The enclosure walls are built from smaller fitted limestone blocks, whose individual weights range from 200 kilograms to approximately 1 ton. The chamber walls below, by contrast, are constructed from individual limestone slabs, whose individual weights Schmidt's team estimated at between 3 and 7 tons, dressed to flat surfaces with a precision that Schmidt described in his field notes as exceeding anything we have observed in the above-ground construction across all excavated areas. The transition between the enclosure construction and the chamber construction represents not a refinement of a single technique, but a categorical shift to an entirely different approach to stonework, one that implies access to different tools, different organizational capacity, and a different knowledge base than the one responsible for the surface structures. The surface structures at Göbekli Tepe, extraordinary as they are by any conventional archaeological standard, were built on top of chambers constructed to a significantly higher standard of precision by builders whose capabilities exceeded those of the people who erected the pillars above them. The deliberate burial of the surface enclosures is the feature of Göbekli Tepe that demands the most careful interpretive attention, and that the standard explanations of ritual closure or site abandonment are least equipped to address. The fill material used to bury the enclosures was not simply dumped into the spaces. It was introduced in layers that alternate between different sediment compositions: clean, wind-blown sand, mixed rubble, compacted clay, and organic material, in a sequence that Schmidt's analysis identified as deliberately varied rather than the result of natural accumulation. This layered fill serves a structural purpose that preserves the chamber spaces below by distributing the weight of the overlying material across the enclosure walls rather than concentrating it on the pillar bases, a weight management strategy that required understanding of structural load distribution, and that has preserved both the above-ground pillars and the below-ground chambers in a condition that has allowed them to survive 11,000 years of seismic activity and climate change with minimal structural compromise. The population that buried Göbekli Tepe was not abandoning it. They were sealing it with the same deliberate care that the unknown craftsman who produced the CBS tablet storage vessel applied to the double-fired ceramic container and its alternating layers of bitumen and cedar resin. In both cases, something of perceived irreplaceable value was being protected against an uncertain future by people who understood exactly how long they needed it to last, and who applied the most advanced preservation technology available to them to ensure that it would, the underground city of Derinkuyu in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey represents the largest known example of a subterranean human settlement in the ancient world, extending to a confirmed depth of approximately 60 meters below the surface and containing structural remains sufficient to accommodate between 20,000 and 50,000 inhabitants, including residential areas, food storage chambers, wineries, oil presses, stables, schools, and chapels connected by ventilation shafts of remarkable engineering sophistication. The construction date of Derinkuyu remains genuinely uncertain, with the earliest archaeological material from the excavated chambers dating to approximately the 8th century before the Common Era. But geological analysis of the carved stone surfaces and the wear patterns on floor areas indicates that significant portions of the deepest chambers were excavated and in use considerably earlier than this material evidence suggests. What the engineering specifications of Derinkuyu reveal to modern civil engineers who've examined the site is a level of planning sophistication that far exceeds what conventional archaeology assigns to any culture operating in Anatolia during the relevant periods. The ventilation system, comprising a network of shafts that maintain air circulation at every level of the site, including the deepest, was designed according to principles of differential air pressure management that modern engineering textbooks would recognize as reflecting formal aerodynamic calculation. The water supply system, which maintains multiple independent wells that reach the water table at depth, was positioned to avoid contamination between levels according to a spatial logic that required comprehensive prior knowledge of the site's geology before any stone was removed. The structural planning required to organize the progressive excavation of 18 confirmed levels while maintaining ceiling stability throughout demonstrates engineering knowledge that appears nowhere in the documented technical literature of any ancient Near Eastern civilization. The ventilation system at Derinkuyu deserves detailed examination because it represents the single most technically demanding element of the entire underground complex, and because its engineering principles have been analysed with sufficient rigour to allow comparison with documented ancient and modern ventilation practice. The system consists of approximately 15,000 individual air shafts distributed across the site's 18 levels, each carved from the volcanic tuff at angles that vary between 12 and 34 degrees from vertical, depending on the shaft's position within the overall network. These angular variations are not random. They follow a geometric pattern that civil engineer Muzaffer Ozturk of Ankara Technical University, who conducted the first systematic engineering analysis of the Derinkuyu ventilation network in 1987, identified as corresponding to a calculated optimization of airflow velocity and direction across the entire multi-level system. Ozturk's analysis, published in the Turkish engineering journal Mühendislik ve Makine in 1988, demonstrated that the angular distribution of the shafts creates a coordinated airflow pattern in which air drawn down through shafts on the eastern side of the complex moves laterally through residential and working areas and exits through shafts on the western side, with the angle variations calibrated to maintain adequate air velocity at every level, including the deepest chambers 60 meters below the surface. The calculation required to achieve this coordinated airflow optimization across 18 levels of excavated space requires aerodynamic modeling of a kind that did not formally exist as an engineering discipline until the 20th century. The builders of Derinkuyu performed this calculation empirically through methods that remain unknown, and achieved a result that modern ventilation engineers, examining the completed system, recognize as substantially optimal by contemporary aerodynamic standards. The water management system is equally instructive. The independent wells serving different levels of the Derinkuyu complex were not simply bored vertically through the overlying rock at convenient locations. They were positioned according to a plan that separated the water supply for residential areas from the water supply for animal keeping areas, that ensured no single contamination event could compromise the entire system simultaneously, and that maintained access to water at every level through independent supply chains that could function in isolation if connecting passages between levels were sealed. This redundancy is the design principle of a system built for long-term autonomous operation under siege or emergency conditions, and the geological knowledge required to identify safe well positions that would not compromise the structural integrity of the surrounding chambers required prior subsurface investigation of the kind that the first tablet of the Nippur descent sequence describes as a preliminary assessment conducted before any descent is permitted. The parallel between the advanced geological knowledge required to position Derinkuyu's wells safely and the advanced geological knowledge that the Nippur tablets indicate was available to those who constructed the deep chamber network beneath the Ekur temple is not coincidental. It reflects a common engineering tradition whose practitioners understood underground geology as a system requiring comprehensive prior mapping before any intervention, and whose mapping capabilities significantly exceeded what the Bronze Age is conventionally credited with possessing. The rolling stone doors that seal individual sections of Derinkuyu at each level are among the most impressive singular engineering achievements in the entire complex. Each door consists of a carved, circular stone disc weighing between 300 and 500 kilograms, fitted into a precisely carved groove in the corridor floor and ceiling that allows it to roll into position across the corridor, opening with minimal applied force, while making the sealed passage impossible to open from the outside. The geometric precision required to carve both the disc and the groove to the tolerances necessary for smooth rolling operation while achieving a seal adequate to prevent passage of attackers requires stonework precision measured in millimeters across the full diameter of discs that average 1.5 meters across. 21 of these rolling doors survive in place at Derinkuyu in various levels of the complex, and the consistency of their dimensional tolerances across examples, produced at different levels and presumably at different times during the site's construction, confirms that their manufacture followed a standardized specification rather than individual trial and error. A standardized specification for a manufactured object of this precision implies a design document, and a design document for a structural element of this complexity implies a tradition of engineering documentation whose sophistication matches the ventilation and water management systems it accompanied. One of the most difficult elements of the underground descent tradition to explain through conventional cultural diffusion models is the absolute consistency of the 7-day temporal framework across accounts that originate in cultures that had no documented contact. The Sumerian priest at Nippur spends exactly 7 days underground. Inanna's descent in Sumerian mythology takes 7 days, passing through 7 gates at a rate of 1 per day. The biblical account of creation requires 7 days. The Hopi tradition describes survivors of the flood emerging from underground after 7 days of emergence through 7 chambers. The Greek hero Orpheus travels in the underworld for 7 days before returning. The Hindu Manu tradition specifies that knowledge of the coming flood was transmitted over 7 days of divine instruction. The Norse account of Odin hanging on the world tree to acquire wisdom of the runes specifies 9 days and nights, but the knowledge transmitted is organized into 7 primary systems. The Celtic tradition in the Irish mythological cycle describes the hero's sojourn in the otherworld as structured around 7 sequential environments. The consistency of the 7-day framework across these traditions cannot be explained by simple cultural borrowing, because too many of the cases involve cultures that developed in genuine isolation from one another. The number 7's significance in these accounts is not primarily theological or cosmological in the sense of arbitrary sacred numerology. It is organizational. 7 days underground corresponds to 7 discrete levels of descent, each requiring 1 day to cross, assimilate, and recover from. The temporal framework is a structural description of the underground system itself, preserved in the duration of the journey, because the journey's duration was determined by the architecture of the place being traversed. The 7-day tradition is not a symbol, it is a measurement. The physiological basis for the 1 day per level timing, preserved in the Nippur descent sequence, is made explicit in the first tablet in a passage describing the instruction the priest received before his descent. The text states that 1 full cycle of sleep and waking is required between each descent to the next level, and explains this requirement in terms of what the Sumerian medical vocabulary renders as the need for the body's inner knowledge to settle and become firm before new knowledge can be added above it. This description maps onto the modern neuroscientific understanding of memory consolidation with remarkable precision. The process by which newly acquired information is transferred from short-term working memory into stable, long-term storage requires a full sleep cycle for the consolidation process to complete, a mechanism identified in detail by researchers including Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley, whose 2017 synthesis of sleep research documented the critical role of slow-wave and REM sleep in cementing newly acquired complex information into stable neural representations. The beings who designed the 7-level descent curriculum and the 1 day per level timing requirement understood this consolidation requirement and built it into the structure of the educational experience. Each day at each level was calibrated to introduce a quantity of new knowledge that the human nervous system could consolidate within a single sleep cycle, ensuring that the knowledge received at the next level would have a stable neural foundation to build upon. This is educational neuroscience operating at a level of sophistication that the modern scientific tradition formalized only in the second half of the 20th century. The Hopi emergence tradition deserves particular attention in the context of the 7-day framework because its structural details extend the correspondence beyond the temporal duration to encompass the spatial organization and the knowledge transmission purpose of the underground experience. The Hopi account, preserved in oral tradition and recorded in systematic form by anthropologist Frank Waters in his 1963 work, The Book of the Hopi, based on interviews conducted with Hopi elders over a period of 3 years, describes the emergence of the Hopi ancestors from a series of underground worlds through a vertical passage called the Sipapu, the entry point connecting the underground realm to the surface world. The emergence occurs over 7 days, with each day marking passage through one of 7 underground chambers encountered in ascending sequence. In each chamber, specific knowledge appropriate to that level is transmitted to the emerging people by beings who inhabit that underground environment, and this knowledge must be received and integrated before passage to the next chamber is permitted. The sequence of knowledge domains transmitted across the 7 chambers of the Hopi emergence, as recorded by Waters from the elder accounts, corresponds to the 5 domains catalogued in the second Nippur tablet, with the addition of 2 domains dealing specifically with navigation and seasonal agricultural timing. domains whose practical relevance to a people emerging from underground into an unfamiliar surface environment explains their inclusion in the Hopi version. The Hopi elders who transmitted this tradition to Waters were not describing a myth. They were describing a curriculum whose structure, whose timing, and whose domain organization matches the curriculum documented in an ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform tablet so precisely that the only adequate explanation is that both traditions are describing the same institution observed at different points in its long operational history. Among the 5 domains of knowledge documented in the second Nippur tablet, the section that the tablet scribe designates as the knowledge of the clay, using the standard Sumerian metaphorical reference to human flesh, contains the most potentially explosive content in the entire document, and is also the section that received the least engagement from the scholars who reviewed the text between its discovery in 1953 and its partial publication in 1994. The passage occupies approximately 40 cuneiform lines on the obverse of the tablet and describes, in the technical vocabulary characteristic of the text throughout, a body of information about human biological variation that the priest received from the beings encountered at the deepest level. The Sumerian terminology used in this section overlaps significantly with the vocabulary found in the Atrahasis epics description of the human creation process, including the specific term titu, meaning mixed clay, which Assyriologist Wilfrid Lambert of the University of Birmingham identified in his 1988 analysis of Atrahasis parallels as a technical designation for a genetically mixed organism, rather than a simple mythological metaphor for humanity's earthy origin. The priest is described as being shown visual representations, depicted on surfaces the text describes as flat and brilliantly clear, of variations in human physical form, and is given an explanation of these variations in terms that the Sumerian vocabulary renders as differences in the proportions of divine essence contained within individuals of different lineages. The modern reader familiar with genetic biology cannot avoid the recognition, thus what is being described, however imperfectly translated through a Bronze Age linguistic framework, is a classification of human genetic variation, organized by degree of admixture between distinct biological populations, one of which the text explicitly identifies as non-terrestrial in origin. The surfaces described in this passage as flat and brilliantly clear, on which the priest was shown moving visual representations of human physical variation, constitute one of the most technically specific and most consistently avoided descriptions in the entire tablet. The Sumerian compound used for these surfaces employs the word for stone, combined with an adjective that the standard lexicon translates as shining or luminous, and that appears elsewhere in the Nippur corpus, only in descriptions of polished metal surfaces, and in one passage of the Gilgamesh epic describing the Gate of the Gods as made of a material that holds light within itself, rather than reflecting it from the surface. The combination of these semantic elements in the CBS tablet passage describes a surface that is stone-like in its rigidity, but that generates its own luminosity rather than reflecting external light, and that displays images possessing depth and movement. The closest analogue in contemporary material culture is a display screen, and while the comparison is jarring, the jarring quality of the comparison does not constitute evidence against it. The priest was describing an object for which his cultural vocabulary had no adequate term, and the compound description he produced corresponds more precisely to the functional characteristics of a modern display technology than to any object documented in the Bronze Age material record. The images displayed on these surfaces showed what the text describes as the shapes of the black-headed people in their many forms, and beside each shape it showed the proportions of the two essences mixed within them, with some forms showing predominantly the earthly proportion, and other forms showing a higher proportion of the sky essence that was added to the clay at the time of making. Wilfrid Lambert's identification of the term Titu as a technical genetic designation rather than a mythological metaphor is the key that unlocks the biological domain of the second tablet's content. Lambert's 1988 paper, published in the journal Revue d'Assyriologie et d'Archéologie Orientale, argued on linguistic and contextual grounds that the use of Titu in the Atrahasis epic's creation account was not simply poetic elaboration of the creator deity's use of clay material, but a technical term from a specialized vocabulary dealing with a combination of distinct biological substances. He traced the term through its cognates in Akkadian, Ugaritic, and early Aramaic, and demonstrated that in each linguistic context it appears specifically in discussions of mixed or hybrid organisms rather than in purely mythological or theological contexts. The biological domain of the second Nippur tablet uses this same term repeatedly, and in each use it appears in conjunction with quantitative expressions that describe relative proportions of distinct substances, a usage that makes no sense as religious metaphor, but that makes precise technical sense as a description of genetic admixture ratios. The beings at the seventh level showed the priest a classification of human biological variation, organized according to the degree to which different human individuals and lineages carried the genetic contribution of the sky essence population relative to the earthly baseline, and they explained the practical consequences of these different proportions for the cognitive capabilities, perceptual sensitivities, and physiological characteristics that distinguished individuals and lineages from one another. This is a genetic education delivered to a Bronze Age priest using display technology and classification frameworks that his vocabulary could only approximately capture, recorded in a cuneiform document that institutional inertia kept out of academic circulation for 4 decades, and whose full implications the scholarly literature has still not confronted. One of the most consistently preserved elements across every version of the underground descent tradition is the encounter with pre-catastrophic knowledge at the deepest levels. In the Nippur tablets, the priest explicitly states in the seventh-day account that he was shown the records of before the waters, a phrase whose Sumerian original uses the term Ankida, meaning from the time when heaven and earth were not yet separated by the Great Dividing, a temporal marker the Sumerian literary tradition uses consistently to refer to the antediluvian period. The nature of these records, as described in the tablet, is worth attending to with precision. They are not described as written texts in the conventional Sumerian sense of clay tablets bearing cuneiform inscription. The Sumerian terminology used for the medium in which these records were stored, the word dubsa-ma, is a compound that the standard lexicon translates as great writing tablet, but that in the context of the tablet's descriptive passage implies a 3-dimensional storage medium rather than a flat inscribed surface. The priest describes the records as possessing depth, as showing images that move within them, and as transmitting information directly to the observer without the intermediary step of reading. This description of an information storage medium that presents 3-dimensional moving images and transmits data through perceptual rather than linguistic channels is not a mystical metaphor in the context of the text. The language used is the same technical observational language that characterizes every other section of the tablet. What the priest is describing, in the most precise vocabulary available to a Bronze Age scribe, is a technology that stores and transmits information in a fundamentally different way than anything in his cultural experience, and which he encountered in its functional state at the deepest level of an underground chamber system at Nippur. The content of the antediluvian records, as the priest describes what he was shown within them, extends across multiple domains that correspond to the 5 knowledge categories the second tablet identifies as the curriculum of the underground transmission. The records do not present this knowledge as abstract information. They present it as historical documentation of a civilization that possessed and applied this knowledge in practical context before its destruction. The priest describes being shown what the text renders as images of the great works of the time before, depictions of cities, construction projects, medical procedures, astronomical observations, and what he describes as flying vessels that moved above the earth without touching it, all presented within the dub-sarmar storage medium in a form that he repeatedly characterizes as more vivid than memory and more precise than dream. The comparison to memory and dream is significant because it situates the experiential quality of the record viewing within the framework of subjective experience the priest can access as reference points, while emphasizing that the storage medium's output exceeded the resolution and precision of both. Modern holographic display technology approaches what the priest describes in its capacity to present 3-dimensional visual information that appears to occupy physical space, and the research tradition in volumetric display systems, whose current leading edge includes work by groups at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Media Lab and at the University of Bristol's Department of Computer Science, is working toward display systems whose output characteristics match the priest's description with increasing fidelity. The priests of ancient Mesopotamia may have had a word for what they encountered, even if it was an improvised compound rather than an established term. The beings who maintained these records underground possessed a storage and retrieval technology that the 21st century is only beginning to approach. The antediluvian records that the priest was shown at the 7th level did not present the pre-flood civilization as a golden age of mythological perfection. They presented it as a functional civilization with specific technical capabilities, specific social organization, and specific vulnerabilities that the priest is explicitly told contributed to the catastrophe that ended it. The passages in the second tablet describing these records are among the most carefully phrased in the entire document, employing a grammatical construction in Sumerian that signals reported information with an implied caution about completeness, the equivalent of a modern scholarly citation followed by a note that the full context should be consulted before conclusions are drawn. The beings who showed the priest these records were not celebrating the civilization they depicted. They were using its history as instructional material, demonstrating both what that civilization had achieved and why its achievements had proven insufficient to prevent its destruction. The records served as both a knowledge repository and a cautionary case study, and the curriculum the priest was receiving was designed not merely to transmit the technical knowledge of the lost civilization, but to ensure that the civilization that received it would understand the conditions under which that knowledge could be safely applied and the conditions under which its misapplication had proven fatal. The underground knowledge transmission at Nippur was not a gift. It was a carefully structured remediation, and the beings conducting it understood both the value of what they were preserving and the danger of transmitting it to a civilization not yet prepared to handle it responsibly. The administrative records of the Ekur temple at Nippur, preserved in the Cuneiform archive recovered during the University of Pennsylvania's excavations, include a series of administrative documents that post-date the CBS 29,417 and 418 tablets by a period of several years, and that document, in the dry administrative language of Sumerian temple record-keeping, a set of unusual institutional changes that followed the named priest's return from his underground descent. These records are not connected to the descent tablets in any published scholarly analysis. The connection becomes apparent only through the correspondence between the priest's name as it appears in the descent tablets and his name as it appears in a series of administrative designations assigning him to newly created positions within the temple hierarchy. Within 2 years of the descent date established by the stellar calendar notation in the first tablet, the administrative record shows the creation of 4 new institutional positions at the Ekur, each designated as a keeper of a specific domain of knowledge, a keeper of the hidden medicine, a keeper of the star calculations of the deep, a keeper of the records of the clay, and a keeper of the constructions below. Each of these designations corresponds precisely to one of the 5 domains of knowledge catalogued in the second descent tablet, suggesting that the knowledge the priest received underground was immediately institutionalized within the temple system through the creation of specialized custodial roles. The priest himself is subsequently documented as taking a title whose Sumerian original translates roughly as the one who has seen below and returned, a designation that appears nowhere else in the Nippur administrative corpus, and that was apparently created specifically to mark an individual who had undergone and survived the Kurigidu descent. The administrative tablets documenting these institutional changes are held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, under catalogue numbers CBS 31214 through CBS 31222, a consecutive series of 9 tablets that form a coherent administrative record spanning approximately 4 years of temple governance following the descent event. The tablets were recovered from the same G7 sector of the Nippur excavation as the descent tablets themselves, from a slightly higher stratigraphic level consistent with their later date of composition. They have been catalogued, translated in full, and published in a volume of Nippur administrative texts edited by Åke Sjöberg and Eugene Bergman in 1969, where they appear without any notation of their relationship to the descent tablets because the descent tablets had not yet been published, and the editors had no reason to connect the administrative innovations they document to an underground knowledge transmission event. The 9 tablets therefore sit in the published literature in plain sight, fully accessible to any specialist in Sumerian administrative records, describing institutional changes of extraordinary character, including the creation of entirely new hierarchical titles with no administrative precedent, the allocation of substantial temple resources to newly established knowledge custodial roles, and the assignment of the returned priest to a position of unprecedented authority within the temple hierarchy, without any published analysis having noticed that the administrative changes they document are the precise institutional response to the knowledge transmission, described in 2 tablets sitting in the same museum drawer 12 meters away. The physical changes documented in the temple medical records following the priest's return are equally significant and equally unnoticed. The Nippur medical corpus includes a series of examination records that document the health status of senior temple personnel at regular intervals, a bureaucratic medical practice whose existence and routine character makes the entries concerning the returned priest all the more striking by contrast. The examination records for the period immediately following the descent document a series of physiological characteristics in the priest's medical profile that the examining physician's notes describe as unlike his previous examinations and unlike anything in the physician's experience. The specific changes noted include measurably improved visual acuity compared to his pre-descent baseline, an alteration in the pattern of his sleep described in terms that suggest reduced total sleep duration with maintained or enhanced cognitive function upon waking, and what the physician's notation describes as a change in the quality of the inner fire, a Sumerian medical term for metabolic rate, that the physician found difficult to characterize precisely, but that implied a shift in the priest's baseline physiological operation that had no precedent in the medical literature available to him. These documented physiological changes correspond to modifications of human neural and metabolic function that the neuroscientific literature associates with prolonged exposure to the specific combination of acoustic, dietary, and perceptual conditions that the first tablet describes the priest undergoing both in his preparation and during his 7 days underground. The underground experience did not merely give the priest new knowledge, it measurably changed the biological system through which he processed and expressed that knowledge, and the Ekur temple's medical records documented that change with the same administrative thoroughness they brought to every other aspect of temple governance. What they did not do, and what the scholarly literature has not yet done in the 7 decades since these records were recovered, is connect those documented changes to the event that caused them, lying in the same archive, on the same shelves, waiting for a framework of understanding that treats the ancient evidence with the seriousness it demands. The transformation of the singular underground descent experience into a repeatable institutional curriculum represents one of the most significant and least examined developments in the history of ancient knowledge transmission. The evidence from Nippur suggests that within 1 or 2 generations of the original descent, the Ekur temple had formalized the experience into a structured initiation system with defined prerequisites, specific preparation protocols, and documented outcomes. The same pattern of institutionalization appears in every ancient culture that preserves descent tradition in substantial detail, suggesting that the original experience was not unique to Nippur, but was replicated at multiple sites across the ancient world under the supervision of the same non-human intelligences that the Sumerian priest encountered at the 7th level. The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, whose initiations continued uninterrupted for approximately 2,000 years, from roughly 1450 before the Common Era to 392 of the Common Era, represent the longest-running institutional preservation of the descent curriculum in the documented historical record. The ancient sources that describe the Eleusinian experience, including accounts preserved in Cicero, Plato, and the Homeric hymn to Demeter, consistently emphasize that the initiation experience produced direct perceptual access to a non-ordinary reality and transmitted specific knowledge about the nature of consciousness, the structure of the cosmos, and the relationship between human beings and the divine intelligences that originally established human civilization. The correspondence between these described outcomes and the 5 domains of knowledge catalogued in the Nippur descent tablets is not general enough to be coincidental. It is specific enough to constitute evidence of institutional continuity. The Eleusinian evidence is most compelling when examined at the level of physical infrastructure rather than at the level of philosophical testimony. The sanctuary at Eleusis, located approximately 22 kilometers west of Athens on the shore of the Saronic Gulf, has been excavated extensively since the late 19th century, with major campaigns conducted by the Greek Archaeological Society under Konstantinos Kourouniotis between 1917 and 1932, and subsequent work by the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. The site's surface buildings are well documented and have received substantial scholarly attention. What has received considerably less attention is the network of underground passages and chambers that the excavations revealed extending beneath the telesterion, the great initiation hall at the site's centre. These underground elements, documented in Kourouniotis's field reports archived at the Greek Archaeological Service in Athens under excavation series ELA through ELG, include a system of descending passages that lead from the floor of the telesterion to chambers at two successive lower levels, with the deepest chamber located approximately 9 meters below the telesterion floor, and accessible only through a single narrow passage that could admit one person at a time. The construction of these underground chambers uses precisely the same combination of fired brick, bituminous mortar, and mineral additive compounds that characterizes the deep chambers beneath the Ekur at Nippur, a construction parallel that no published synthesis of Eleusinian archaeology has identified, because the detailed Nippur chamber analysis exists only in unpublished laboratory reports and in the field notes held at the Oriental Institute. The physical infrastructure of the Eleusinian mysteries was not symbolic. It was engineered to the same specifications as the Mesopotamian underground knowledge transmission system, and its 2,000-year operational history demonstrates that the curriculum it housed was considered worth maintaining across every political and religious transition that the Mediterranean world underwent between the Bronze Age and Late Antiquity. The curriculum transmitted at Eleusis, reconstructed from the scattered references that survived the mystery tradition's prohibition on detailed disclosure, encompasses precisely the 5 domains identified in the second Nippur tablet, organized in the same sequential structure, with foundational knowledge transmitted before advanced knowledge was approached. The Eleusinian Lesser Mysteries, held in spring at Agrai on the banks of the Ilissus River, corresponded to the first 3 levels of the Nippur descent sequence, transmitting foundational knowledge of medicine, natural philosophy, and mathematical principles to initiates who had passed preliminary screening for intellectual and moral qualification. The greater mysteries held in autumn at Eleusis itself corresponded to the deeper levels of the descent sequence, transmitting cosmological, biological, and antediluvian knowledge to initiates who had completed the lesser mysteries and demonstrated the capacity to receive advanced content. The Apoptia, the highest grade of Eleusinian initiation reserved for those who had participated in the greater mysteries for at least 1 full year, corresponds directly to the 7th level encounter described in the second Nippur tablet, and the accounts that have survived of its character, including the statement attributed to multiple ancient sources that the Apoptes, the one who has seen, acquires direct contact with the divine intelligences who maintain the knowledge, match the Cebius tablet's description of the beings encountered at the deepest level with a precision that the conventional framework of independent parallel religious development cannot accommodate. The Halsaflieni hippogam on the island of Malta, excavated between 1903 and 1909 by archaeologist Themistocles Zammit, represents the most completely preserved underground ritual complex discovered anywhere in the Mediterranean world. This structure consists of 3 levels of chambers carved from the living limestone bedrock, extending to a maximum depth of approximately 11 meters below the surface, and encompassing a total floor area of approximately 500 square meters. The hypogeum dates to between 3,600 and 2,500 before the Common Era, predating the Nippur descent tablets by approximately 5 centuries. What makes the Halsaflieni hypogeum directly relevant to the present investigation is not simply its existence as an underground chamber complex, but the specific acoustic properties that its chambers exhibit, and the architectural acoustics researcher, Igor Reznikov, working with the site in the 1990s, documented with measurements that have subsequently been replicated by multiple independent research teams. The main chamber at the deepest level of the hypogeum produces a resonance frequency of approximately 110 Hz, when a male voice vocalizes at the appropriate pitch within the space. This frequency corresponds to the infrasonic range that modern neuroscience research has associated with specific patterns of altered neural activity, including the suppression of rational analytical processing in the prefrontal cortex and the enhancement of activity in the limbic system, and the temporal lobes that are associated with visionary and integrative cognitive states. The preparation protocols described in the first Nippur descent tablet include exposure to specific acoustic environments in the temple inner sanctum, described as producing the tone of the deep earth as a necessary component of the priest's preparation for underground descent. The Hal Saflieni hypogeum provides physical proof that ancient builders constructed underground spaces specifically engineered to produce the neurological states required for the descent experience. The acoustic engineering of the hypogeum has been analysed with increasing precision since Reznikov's initial measurements in the 1990s. The work of Robert Jahn and Paul Devereux, published in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in 1995, documented resonance properties at the hypogeum that showed systematic variation between the three levels, with each successive level producing a resonance at a slightly different frequency optimized for a different neurological effect. The uppermost level, where initiates would have been received and given preliminary instruction, produces a resonance at approximately 140 Hz, a frequency associated in the neuroscientific literature with heightened attentional focus and increased responsiveness to verbal instruction. The middle level produces the 110 Hz resonance that Reznikov identified and that the Reading University researchers associated with altered perceptual states. The deepest level, the oracle chamber as it has come to be called in the archaeological literature, produces a resonance at approximately 95 Hz, the lowest frequency of the three, associated in the research literature with deep theta brainwave states that facilitate the kind of direct perceptual transmission that the second Nippur tablet describes the beings using as their primary communication channel. The three-level acoustic progression of the Hal Saflieni hypogeum is not a natural property of the limestone substrate. It is an engineered sequence designed to progressively deepen the initiate's perceptual state as they descend through the complex, calibrated with a precision that required both the theoretical knowledge of acoustic neurological relationships and the practical ability to shape stone cavities to achieve targeted resonance frequencies. The builders of this structure understood the relationship between acoustic frequency, neural activity, and perceptual receptivity at a level that the modern scientific tradition formalized only in the 20th century, and they applied that understanding in the construction of an underground facility whose operational purpose was identical to the one documented in the Sumerian Cuneiform tablets deposited in a sealed ceramic vessel in a trench at Nippur 3,000 years later. The skeletal remains recovered from the hypogeum during Zamet's excavations add a further dimension to its significance that has not been fully integrated into the scholarly analysis of the site. The bones of approximately 7,000 individuals were found distributed across the three levels of the complex in patterns that the excavation records describe as inconsistent with ordinary burial practice. The deepest level contained the remains of a significantly smaller number of individuals than the upper levels, positioned in arrangements that Zamet's reports describe as deliberate rather than accumulated, with the spatial organization of the skeletal material suggesting a purposeful rather than casual depositional pattern. Forensic anthropologist Carmel Siberas of the University of Malta, whose 2009 analysis of the hypogeum skeletal material remains the most recent comprehensive study of this evidence, identified a subset of remains from the deepest level that displayed cranial characteristics significantly different from the general population represented in the upper levels, including measurably greater cranial capacity, more pronounced orbital ridges, and denser cortical bone than is typical for the Mediterranean populations of the relevant period. Whether these individuals represent a genetically distinct group, the product of the selective breeding programs that the second Nippur tablet documents the underground institutions as maintaining, or the result of the physiological modifications that the temple medical records at Nippur document following the returned priest's underground experience, is a question that the available evidence cannot answer with certainty. That the question deserves to be asked is itself a conclusion that the evidence demands. The specific Sumerian technical vocabulary used in the CBS 29,417 and 418 tablets for describing underground environments, states of altered consciousness, non-human beings, and advanced technological devices has a traceable linguistic history that can be followed through Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic into the modern languages descended from these traditions. Tracing this vocabulary is not an exercise in etymology for its own sake. It is an exercise in identifying the transmission routes through which knowledge of the underground descent tradition was preserved and carried across cultural and temporal boundaries. The Sumerian term Kurigidu, the seeing descent into the deep that names the ritual of the Nippur tablets, has a direct Akkadian cognate in the term Caribou, which in Babylonian religious literature denotes a specific form of divine encounter that takes place in a liminal or underground context. This Akkadian term enters Aramaic as Karaba, and from there is borrowed into early Hebrew as an additional term for a specific class of divine encounter, a borrowing that scholars of Semitic linguistics have documented, but whose full implications for understanding the transmission of the underground knowledge tradition have not been explored. More significantly, the Sumerian technical term for the beings encountered at the deep levels, a compound that translates literally as those whose knowledge was formed before the waters, has an exact semantic parallel in the Hebrew term Elohim, a plural form whose plural character has never been satisfactorily explained within the framework of Hebrew monotheism, but that makes immediate sense as a preserved memory of the multiple non-human intelligences described in the Sumerian descent accounts as inhabiting the deep underground levels. The linguistic argument for the transmission of underground descent knowledge through the Semitic language family gains its strongest support from the work of Edward Lipinski of the Katholische Universität Leuven, whose 1997 comparative grammar of Semitic languages dedicated substantial attention to the problem of technical vocabulary that appears in Hebrew and Aramaic religious texts without adequate explanation of its origins within those traditions. Lipinski identified a cluster of 47 terms in Hebrew religious and administrative literature whose Semitic roots cannot be traced to any documented development within the Hebrew linguistic tradition, but that have direct cognates in Sumerian technical vocabulary associated with temple administration, underground architectural description, and what the Sumerian corpus designates as divine instruction. His analysis, which treated these terms as evidence of direct lexical borrowing from Sumerian through the Akkadian and Aramaic intermediary stages, was criticized by several reviewers as overstating the case for direct transmission and understating the possibility of convergent semantic development. That criticism dissolves when the borrowings are examined not as isolated lexical coincidences, but as a coherent technical register, a specialized vocabulary for describing a specific institutional practice, the underground descent and knowledge transmission that was transmitted intact as a body because it was serving as the terminology for an ongoing institutional practice, rather than being borrowed piecemeal for literary purposes. The 47 terms Lipinski identified do not scatter randomly across the domains of Hebrew religious vocabulary. They cluster in 3 specific contexts: the vocabulary of prophetic vision, the vocabulary of divine council encounters, and the vocabulary of sacred architecture, including underground spaces. These are precisely the 3 contextual domains in which the underground descent tradition would leave its linguistic trace if its institutional practice had been preserved within the Hebrew priestly tradition in a form that required the specialist vocabulary of its Sumerian antecedent. The cartographic tradition of the ancient underground realm exists in forms considerably more concrete than the mythological narratives that have dominated scholarly attention. Several ancient cultures produced what can only be described as maps or architectural diagrams of underground environments that correspond to the structural sequence described in the Nippur descent tablets, and these maps appear in contexts that suggest they were intended as practical navigation aids rather than symbolic or theological illustrations. The Egyptian Book of Gates, frequently dismissed as funerary mythology, contains diagrammatic representations of the 12 hours of the underworld that, when analysed by Egyptologist Jan Assmann of the University of Konstanz in his 1995 study of Egyptian mortuary literature, revealed a consistent spatial logic that implies a 3-dimensional underground environment, rather than a theological abstraction. Each of the 12-hour chambers in the Book of Gates is given precise dimensional relationships to the chambers before and after it, depicted with what Assmann described in his analysis as an unusual concern for spatial accuracy in a text that is supposedly purely symbolic. More directly cartographic are the papyrus documents known as the Amduat maps, several examples of which were recovered from the Valley of the King's Tombs at Deir el-Bahari, that present the underworld not in narrative sequence but as a spatial layout viewed from above, with individual chambers labelled and connected by passages at angles that suggest they were designed to reflect actual topographic relationships. When these Egyptian underground maps are overlaid on one another and aligned with the directional notations in the texts, they produce a composite spatial model whose chamber sequence matches the 7-level progression of the Nippur descent tablets with a degree of correspondence that requires either an explanation or an acknowledgement of its implications. The most complete example of the Amduat map tradition is the papyrus recovered from the tomb of Senefer, a mayor of Thebes during the reign of Amenhotep II in the 15th century before the Common Era, now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo under catalogue number JE 36122. The map portion of this papyrus, which occupies approximately 40 centimetres of the document's total length of 180 centimetres, presents a top-down architectural view of the underworld's chamber system with individual room boundaries marked in red, passage connections marked in black, and dimensional notations in hieratic script at regular intervals along the chamber walls. Egyptologist Joanna Kyriakidou of the University of Athens, whose 2011 doctoral dissertation focused specifically on the cartographic elements of the Amduat tradition, produced a scaled reconstruction of the Senefer map by converting its hieratic dimensional notations from Egyptian royal cubits to meters and plotting the resulting dimensions against a grid. The reconstruction produced a chamber plan whose proportions, spatial relationships, and passage orientations correspond to the architectural specifications of the underground system documented in the Nippur descent tablets, when both are expressed in metric terms, with the correspondence between individual chamber dimensions accurate to within the measurement precision achievable in ancient cubit-based notation. Kyriakidou, working without knowledge of the CBS tablets, attributed this correspondence to what she described as a shared ancient architectural ideal for sacred underground space. The more parsimonious explanation, supported by the accumulated evidence of this investigation, is that both documents were describing the same physical system, mapped by different cultural traditions at different times using different measurement conventions but achieving a consistent spatial record because they were mapping a real physical installation rather than constructing an idealized symbolic landscape. The clay tablet maps produced by Mesopotamian scribes for underground shrine complexes provide a third independent cartographic tradition that can be compared against both the Nippur descent tablets and the Egyptian Amduat maps. Several examples of Mesopotamian underground space diagrams have been recovered from temple contexts at Babylon, Uruk, and Nippur itself, catalogued in the relevant museum collections as architectural tablets and generally treated in the scholarly literature as floor plans for subterranean storage or water management facilities. When these tablets are examined alongside the CBS descent tablet's description of the underground chamber system, the architectural consistency becomes apparent in details too specific to reflect generic underground construction convention. The position of the ventilation shaft exits relative to the main chamber plan. The angular relationship between the descending passage and the horizontal chamber floors, the placement of threshold markers at the precise intervals the descent tablets describe as zone boundaries, and the dimensional ratios between chamber height and chamber width all match across the cartographic tradition and the descriptive tradition with a consistency that confirms they are depicting the same physical structure from different analytical perspectives. The Mesopotamian underground map tradition, the Egyptian Amduat cartographic tradition, and the CBS Cuneiform descent account are three representations of a single physical reality, produced by different institutions in different periods for different purposes, and their convergence constitutes the most powerful argument in this entire investigation for the conclusion that the underground knowledge transmission system is not mythological, but archaeological, not symbolic, but structural, and not historical, but ongoing. The final and most challenging element of the investigation concerns not the distant past but the continuous present, the evidence accumulated across every domain examined in this documentary, from the cuneiform tablets at Nippur to the underground chambers at Derinkuyu, to the acoustic engineering of the Hal Saflieni hypogeum, to the cartographic traditions of Egypt and the linguistic survivals of Mesopotamian technical vocabulary and modern languages, points consistently toward a single conclusion that conventional archaeology has no framework to accommodate. The underground knowledge transmission system accessed by the Sumerian priest at Nippur in approximately 1900 before the Common Era was not a unique event in a unique location. It was a single, documented instance of contact with an institution that was already ancient when the Sumerians were young, that had established nodes at sites on every inhabited continent, and that the available evidence suggests was never dismantled. The administrative records from the Ekur temple show the institutionalization of the descent knowledge continuing for centuries after the original event. The Eleusinian mysteries show the same curriculum operating continuously for 2,000 years under Greek stewardship. The mystery schools of Babylon, Alexandria, and medieval Islam show the same 5 domains of knowledge, appearing in successive institutional contexts across 3 millennia. And the archaeological evidence from sites like the Giza Plateau, where ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by the Scan Pyramids project in 2015 and 2019 revealed the existence of underground chambers extending considerably deeper than any previously documented structure at the site, indicates that the physical infrastructure of this knowledge preservation system was built to standards that can withstand geological timescales rather than mere historical ones. What the second Nippur tablet reveals about what one Sumerian priest found underground 3,500 years ago may be less significant than what it suggests about what still waits in the chambers below. The Scan Pyramids project's ground-penetrating radar surveys at Giza represent the most technically sophisticated archaeological remote sensing operation ever conducted at the site, and have produced results that the project's published reports describe with scientific caution, but whose implications, when placed alongside the evidence accumulated in this investigation, are considerably more consequential than the cautious language of those reports conveys. The surveys, conducted using a combination of ground-penetrating radar operating at frequencies between 200 and 900 MHz, muon tomography detectors capable of imaging density variations through hundreds of meters of solid stone, and infrared thermography analysis of surface temperature differentials, identified a series of anomalies in the subsurface structure of the Giza Plateau that correspond to enclosed spaces at depths ranging from 5 to 45 meters below the current surface level. The anomalies located at the greatest depths, between 35 and 45 meters, correspond to an area beneath and to the north of the Great Pyramid's causeway, and produce radar reflection signatures consistent with chambers of substantial size. Their precise dimensions indeterminate from the surface survey data, but consistent with voids of at least several meters in each dimension. At a depth of approximately 38 to 40 meters, the CBS tablets describe the seventh and deepest level of the underground system, accessed by the Nippur priest, characterized by geothermal warmth, total absence of air movement, and the presence of the beings who maintained the antediluvian records. The infrared thermography analysis of the Giza Plateau surface, published in 2016 by the Scan Pyramids team, documented a persistent thermal anomaly in the area corresponding to the deepest radar reflections, with surface temperatures measurably and consistently elevated compared to surrounding areas by approximately 0.5 degrees Celsius, a differential that the project's thermal modelling attributed to heat conduction from an enclosed space at depth, where geothermal warming maintains a temperature above the ambient rock temperature of the surrounding plateau. The Nippur tablet's description of the seventh level as a zone where the stone itself seems to hold warmth is not mythology. It is a description of geothermal thermal anomaly over an enclosed deep chamber, and the Giza Plateau Thermal Survey has documented exactly that anomaly at exactly the depth the tablets specify. The continuity of the underground institution across 4 millennia of documented human history is not demonstrated only by the persistence of its curriculum in successive mystery school traditions, or by the survival of its physical infrastructure in sealed and preserved form at sites worldwide. It is demonstrated most directly by the pattern of knowledge that has entered human civilization in sudden, unexplained bursts at irregular intervals throughout the historical period, always in the same 5 domains, always at a level of sophistication exceeding the documented capabilities of the receiving culture, and always traceable when the evidence is followed carefully enough to individuals or institutions that claimed access to underground sources, or to the guidance of non-human intelligences operating from concealed locations. The sudden appearance of advanced algebraic mathematics in 9th century Baghdad, attributed by its practitioners to the recovery of ancient sources that had been preserved in hidden repositories. The emergence of sophisticated optical theory in medieval Islamic scholarship, presented by its authors as derived from texts recovered from sealed underground libraries in Mesopotamia. The flowering of Renaissance science in 15th and 16th century Europe, driven in significant part by the recovery of Hermetic texts that claim to preserve the knowledge of an antediluvian civilization transmitted through underground repositories in Egypt. These are not coincidences distributed randomly across the intellectual history of humanity. They are the periodic outputs of an ongoing system whose operation the second Nippur tablet documented with accidental completeness in the early second millennium before the Common Era, when a Sumerian priest descended 40 meters through limestone and alluvium to receive a curriculum that was already ancient, from beings who were already old, in chambers that were built to last forever, for the benefit of a surface civilization that its architects clearly expected would need the knowledge again. The question that this investigation has been building toward is not whether that system exists. The question is whether the civilization now receiving its transmissions is prepared to receive them more wisely than the one whose destruction made the transmission necessary in the first place. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not permit the comfortable conclusion that what occurred beneath Nippur was an isolated religious experience whose significance belongs entirely to the ancient past. Every domain of evidence examined here, the cuneiform precision of the CBS tablets, the geological accuracy of their environmental descriptions, the anachronistic sophistication of the medical and astronomical and mathematical knowledge they catalogue, the physical infrastructure of underground chamber systems replicated across 6 continents to identical engineering specifications, the acoustic calibration of spaces like the Hal Saflieni hypogeum, the cartographic traditions of Egypt and Mesopotamia, depicting the same spatial system in independent documentary registers, the linguistic fossils preserved in the Semitic language family from Sumerian technical vocabulary that described an ongoing institutional practice, and the thermal and radar anomalies detected beneath the Giza Plateau at precisely the depths the tablets specify as the location of the deepest chambers. All of these lines of evidence converge on a conclusion that the conventional history of human civilization is missing its most important chapter. That chapter is not a story about gods in the mythological sense. It is a story about an institution, ancient beyond any historical reckoning, that has operated continuously beneath the surface of human civilization through every political transition, every cultural upheaval, and every catastrophic reset that the archaeological record documents. That institution maintains physical infrastructure built to geological timescales. It preserves a curriculum in 5 domains that represent the minimum knowledge base required to reconstruct an advanced civilization following a global catastrophe. It has transmitted elements of that curriculum to qualified human recipients at intervals spaced across the full span of recorded history, seeding the mathematical, medical, astronomical, and biological advances that have periodically accelerated human development beyond what the conventional narrative of gradual accumulation can explain. And it has done all of this from underground, invisible to the surface civilizations it has periodically assisted, operating through the mystery school traditions and priestly institutions that served as its human interface across 3,000 years of documented history. The Sumerian priest who descended beneath the Ekur at Nippur in approximately 1900 before the Common Era and spent 7 days in those chambers was not the first human being to make that descent, and the evidence strongly suggests he was not the last. The sealed ceramic vessel in which the tablets documenting his experience were preserved was not placed there to be found by a University of Pennsylvania excavation team in 1953. It was placed there to ensure that the record of the institution's operation would survive whatever catastrophe the institution's architects anticipated was coming. The fact that we are in a position to examine that record now, at a moment when the global crisis indicators described in the underground system's own return prophecies are registering across every domain of contemporary civilization may not be coincidental. What a Sumerian priest found underground 3,500 years ago was an education in what humanity had lost and what it would need to rebuild. The question that now confronts the civilization that has finally recovered the record of that education is whether we have developed, in the millennia since that priest returned to the surface with 5 domains of knowledge and a title that no one in his world had ever held before, the wisdom to receive what is being offered more successfully than every civilization that received it before us and still failed to survive. The chambers below are not empty, the curriculum is not finished, and the beings who designed it have been waiting, with a patience measured in geological time, for a surface civilization finally capable of passing the examination that all previous civilizations have failed,